Chapter 86. You. Jean Rulin looked at Su Li, who was sitting in the position of workshop owner. She stammered for a long time and then burst into laughter. Su Li, Lecturer Gong gave the position of special class teacher to you. It was the worst decision she made in her life. It seems that you have been fascinated by the sudden fame. You even dare to be the workshop owner? Do you think that you are the workshop owner? Su Li ignored the stunned stewards and knocked on the table with her slender fingers. She said slowly, "Unfortunately, I just took over the position of workshop owner. You are the embroidery artificer of the embroidery workshop. Don't you know who the former workshop owner is?" Hearing that, Jean Rulin suddenly stopped laughing like a strangled duck. She really didn't know who the former workshop owner was. Although she was a senior embroidery artificer in the embroidery workshop, she had never embroidered a piece of cloth here. Every time the workshop owner came, she was not there. Other embroidery artificers didn't have a deep relationship with her, and they didn't mention the name of the workshop owner. How could she know? Gao Dehai, go and call the chief steward of the embroidery workshop. Su Li ignored Jean Rulin, who was standing aside, and ordered. Gao Dehai trembled slightly and hurried out of the central hall without saying anything. After less than 5 minutes, Su Li saw a white-haired old man hurrying in. When he saw Su Li, he immediately saluted without hesitation and said, "I am Jian, the chief steward of the embroidery workshop. It's my pleasure to meet the new workshop owner. Workshop owner, please forgive me for not greeting you when you come from afar." As the chief steward, Jian was naturally more well-informed than other stewards. He had long known that the new workshop owner was a 15-year-old girl. But her embroidery skills were better than that of old workshop owner Gong. She might even create a school of embroidery and leave a lasting legacy. Jian naturally tried his best to flatter such a person and hoped to leave his name in the history books. Su Li hurriedly let Jian stand up and said, "Grandpa Jia, you don't have to be so polite. I am a junior and shouldn't be so polite. But since Senior Gong put the responsibility on me, I have to accept it." Seeing that Su Li was so mature at such a young age, Jian was relieved and said with a smile, "Workshop owner, you are so polite. I hope you can take care of the embroidery workshop in the future." Jean Rulin, who was listening to their conversation, had already become a sculptor. Su Li was the workshop owner? And she actually wanted to get someone to arrest her and send her to the authorities? It's over. Jean Rulin only felt that everything in front of her was black, and she wanted to pass out directly. "Boss, what's going on?" When Jian saw Jean Rulin and Yan Hongxiu in the central hall, he immediately felt something unusual. Speaking of which, today is the day when the gold embroidery artificer takes the assessment to become a top embroidery artificer. "Workshop owner, can you start now?" Su Li shook her head slightly and said, "I am not only the workshop owner but also the lecturer of the Qinghe Girls' School. Jean Rulin is my student. How could I not know her embroidery skills? Compared with the top embroidery artificer, she must be a little less intelligent. And today, Jean Rulin, you are impulsive. You wronged others for no reason. You are too impetuous. How can you embroider exquisite works? I will punish you to reflect on your mistakes for 3 months. If you can repent, then you can take the test again. Jean Rulin, do you have any objections?" Jean Rulin lowered her head and almost bit her lips to bleed. Finally, she suddenly relaxed and said in a low voice, "It's up to you." Su Li's eyes flashed a touch of profound meaning and she nodded slightly. She picked up the bamboo hat and veil brought by Yan Hongxiu and said to Jian, "Let's go to the embroidery room to have a look. Since I am here, I can't come in vain." Jian understood that Su Li was going to instruct the embroidery artificer. There was a kind of expectation in his heart. He didn't look at Jean Rulin and left the central hall with Su Li. "My bamboo hat." Yan Hongxiu stood up and watched Su Li go away. She muttered with grievance. Su Li really didn't regard herself as an outsider. The bamboo hat and veil were both brought by her. However, Yan Hongxiu didn't feel disgusted by Su Li at all. She also felt surprised. If it were others, she would definitely scold them. Could it be that she would only lose her temper to those who were worse than her? Couldn't she scold those who were better than her? That's not right. The third brother is much better than me, but he is scolded by me every day. Yen Hongxiu couldn't figure it out. She couldn't help but knock her head. Then she stomped her feet and left. Since there was no fun to watch, she would go back to the mansion to continue to practice the bow. In the blink of an eye, there was only Jean Ruolin in the central hall. Looking at the empty room, Jean Ruolin took out the nameplate of Senior Embroidery Artificer. She stared at it for a moment and suddenly pinched it hard. Her knuckles turned white. Su Li, I won't let it go. A commoner wants to be the workshop owner? It's so funny. Oh. Jean Ruolin laughed in a low voice. Her laughter became louder and louder, and then she became crazy. The humiliation she suffered in Su Li's hands in the past 2 days was more than 10 years of her life. If she didn't take revenge, she wouldn't be the pearl of the Jean family. In the embroidery workshop, the embroidery skill was the best pass. Su Li covered her face and instructed the top embroidery artificers with Jian. Then she went to other embroidery rooms. In just one afternoon, all the embroidery artificers had accepted the identity of the new workshop owner. Although they knew that Su Li was young from her figure, no one dared to gossip in front of Su Li's embroidery skill. That night, Su Li went back to the school. Everything seemed very calm. However, the news that a commoner girl with no background became the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop had been known by all the big families through various channels. For a time, the undercurrent was turbulent. No one knew what would happen when Su Li came to the embroidery workshop. When Su Li returned to the school, she saw Mei Ruhan standing in front of the gate. She didn't know who she was waiting for. Mei Ruhan's eyes lit up when she saw Su Li. She ran to Su Li quickly and said, "Li, you finally come back. I have been waiting for you here after class. I didn't expect that you really came back." Su Li hadn't seen Mei Ruhan for a long time. She also felt very close to her. She smiled and said, "What are you waiting for me for? Where is Gua?" "Gua." Mei Ruhan hesitated for a long time and finally confessed, "In order to lighten my burden, she went to do odd jobs outside the school." Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows and said, "Don't you have enough money?" As far as she knew, the Mei family was also a big family. They shouldn't limit Mei Ruhan's expenses in the Qinghe girls' school. It should be enough. Mei Ruhan blushed. She shook Su Li's arm and said coquettishly, "Oh, don't ask so much. Can you find an odd job for me?" Su Li couldn't help laughing. Mei Ruhan might have done something impulsively which led to the current predicament. But she was embarrassed to tell her. However, the Linli building happened to need a helper. She had already appreciated Mei Ruhan's cleverness in the Muyang girls' school. Since the opportunity was ready-made, there was no reason for Su Li not to use it. After thinking about it, Su Li nodded and said with a smile, "I know a place that is suitable for you." "Really? Where is it?" Mei Ruhan was happy. She wanted to have a try with Su Li. She didn't know anyone else in the Qinghe town. It was not suitable for her to find Ningqing. Although Su Li was now a special class lecturer, she was too young. Mei Ruhan still thought it was easier to find Su Li for help. "It is a winery, but it is not an ordinary winery." Su Li smiled sweetly and said, "It's not enough to just study. Since you want to be an extraordinary woman with unparalleled wisdom, of course, you have to get in touch with the ways of the world and even the deceitful Jianghu. Are you willing to go?" An extraordinary woman with unparalleled wisdom. Mei Ruhan's eyes brightened. She nodded and said, "If there is such an experience field, Ruhan is willing to have a try. Even if I die, I won't regret it?" Su Li's tone suddenly became cold and her expression was serious. Mei Ruhan was startled. Her face was slightly pale, but there was a heat that was different from fear in her eyes. "Even if I die, I won't regret it." Hearing Mei Ruhan's childish answer, Su Li smiled slightly and became gentle again. She said, "Go back and wait for the news. It will take me about a month to take you there." Mei Ruhan nodded and then said bitterly, "Li, can you lend me some silver? I will return it to you when I work in the winery and earn money." Su Li couldn't help laughing. She gave Mei Ruhan 1,000 taels of silver without asking more. After Su Li left, Mei Ruhan's heart was still beating wildly. She knew that Su Li was not a person without a target. Since Su Li said so, There must be something very important for her to participate. Mei Ruhen, who had never experienced any danger in her life, was very excited at the moment. Next, Su Li's life in the school became calm. Every day, Su Li would go to the winery early in the morning and would not come back until the building was closed in the evening. At night, Su Li meditated instead of sleeping. She practiced hard all day long. Finally, she broke through the bottleneck after half a month and broke through to the inborn second hurdle. This speed was extremely fast, but Su Li was still not satisfied. If she didn't use all the 400,000 taels of silver to build the winery, her practice speed could be increased by 3 times. However, Su Li found that slow also had its advantages. She was reading widely. Although it had nothing to do with the Ghost Valley meditation direction, she could draw parallels and bring inspiration to her. Then her understanding of the Ghost Valley meditation direction went to a higher level. It was worth mentioning that she accidentally condensed the second kind of starlight with the secret method one night. This kind of starlight was not like any of the starlight mentioned by Qi Xianqing. Su Li could only put it aside for the time being and wait for the opportunity to understand it later. Qi Xianqing said that the potential of the wood starlight was not enough to reach a higher realm, let alone compared with other killing stars. Su Li condensed a soybean-sized green starlight at the fingertips of her right hand. However, I refined poison for many years in my previous life. What can be used as medicine and poison? In my hands, it can not only become a thing to save people, but also a weapon to kill people. And this, Su Li's left fingertips shook slightly, and a faint fluorescence appeared. If Su Li's eyesight had not been greatly improved after she reached the inborn hurdle, she could not see clearly who was inside. The shape inside is constantly changing, like a knife, a sword, and all kinds of weapons in the world. This kind of starlight, what is it? Su Li was puzzled. Moreover, she still remembered that Qi Xianqing said that a person would only comprehend one kind of starlight in his life. Why did she have 2? Was it because of her rebirth? Then, Su Li denied this speculation. The Ghost Valley meditation direction she practiced in her previous life was a complete mess. There was no secret method to cooperate with it, let alone the horrifying star power above the inborn hurdle. It seems that the change brought by the second half of the Ghost Valley meditation direction. If so, this practice method is more precious than I thought. Su Li's eyes flashed with contemplation. The realm above the inborn hurdle was simply a legend in the martial arts circle. No one even saw what the existence above the inborn hurdle would be. It could be said that no one in the entire Dahan country knew it better than her. She reached the peak of the inborn hurdle in her previous life, but she was stuck at that step. No matter how hard she struggled, she could not break through. Finally, she made up her mind to enter that kind of impasse. It was almost suicidal, but it also made her see higher and farther. If she practiced to the peak of the inborn hurdle in this life and then stimulated by the star power. Su Li was slightly shocked. At this moment she thought of many things, but soon she gave up all the ideas. Chapter 87. As Su Li continued to study her practice, time passed quietly. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. Qinghe Prefecture was decorated with lanterns and streamers. The spring festival was coming. In the courtyard of the school, Su Li sat in front of the window and quietly watched the snow falling outside. During the spring festival this year, her eldest brother, Su Qingtan, was meditating in the National Academy and had no time to go back. She didn't need to go back either. She just used the excuse of going back to the Qinghe school. When Su Huanli heard that it was the Qinghe school, he agreed immediately. He also told her to inquire about whether there were any cheaper shops in the Qinghe town. At this moment, Mammy Li came from behind and said, "Miss, young Master Fong sent a message saying that the winery has been built." Su Li nodded. "Let's go there. There is no one in the school. It's not appropriate for me to stay here." Mammy Li took her luggage and followed Su Li to the gate of the school. When the guard at the gate saw Su Li, he immediately smiled and said, "Lecturer Su, are you going back for the new year?" Su Li smiled sweetly and said, "It's really hard for you to protect the school." "Ah, not at all, not at all." Hearing Lecturer Su's words, I feel warm all over. Have a safe trip, Lecturer Su. The guard said goodbye warmly, not for anything else, but because Su Li often went out in the past month, and every time she passed by, she would bring some delicious food for them. No lecturer in the school could do that. They were also human beings. Receiving such meticulous kindness, they were naturally moved and regarded Su Li as a close person. No matter who came to ask about Su Li's whereabouts, they would help to cover up in order to protect Su Li, which saved Su Li a lot of trouble. Walking on the street, Su Li put on a cloak and a hat. Mammy Li also put on her bamboo hat. In this world of ice and snow, the passers-by were hurrying, and no one would take a good look at their faces. On a second-class street in Qinghe City, a 3-story building stood out like a crane in a flock of chickens. It stood among a group of low-rise shops and was particularly eye-catching. The paint of the tall building was extremely bright, and its entire body was dark red. It was also made of this year's new wood. Just looking at it made him want to go in and take a seat. Even if it was just a cup of tea, it would be very comfortable. Why doesn't the Linli building open? I'd like to go in and see what's going on here. I'm sick of the food in the city. I really hope this is a restaurant. Could it be a place for bathing? Hee, I see that this building is elegant and unique. It's definitely not what you are thinking. In the past 2 days, I've seen many manservants busying themselves with decorations. I believe that once they're done, it'll be time to open the door. Since I still have some red packet money on me during the new year, I'll go in and enjoy myself. Many people were looking forward to it. Some people estimated that the building would cost at least 200,000 taels of silver. This price did not include the land. It was much higher than the construction cost of a normal restaurant. At this moment, Fong Ling rubbed her small hands and stood outside the back door of the Linli building. She kept looking around. Suddenly, her eyes brightened and she shouted, "They are coming!" When Su Li walked to the door, she heard Fong Ling calling. Then she saw Haydn and a group of people rush out and snatch the parcel from Mammy Li's hand. They surrounded her and entered the building. Looking at the sumptuous dishes on the round table in the lobby, Su Li had a strange feeling and didn't know what to feel for a while. "Sister Li, these are all my work," Fong Ling said with a red face. "Although they are not as delicious as yours, they are the New Year's Eve dinner I prepared for you." Su Li touched Fong Ling's small head and said in an unprecedentedly gentle voice, "Ling is great. I'll teach you to cook more delicious food in the future." Fong Ling had never been praised by Su Li in such an exaggerated way. She said, with tears and buried her head in Su Li's chest. Fong Yuan looked at them, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. No matter what Su Li's purpose was to build this place, it was enough for them to have a place to settle down and make them feel happy. Of course, it would be better if it wasn't called the Linli building. Thinking of this, Fong Yuan felt a little sad in his heart. He didn't understand this feeling. He just felt a little uncomfortable. However, he never told anyone about this feeling, even to Chu Qingning. He was afraid that if he mentioned it, he would destroy everything in front of him. After the New Year's Eve dinner, Chu Qingning stretched himself comfortably and gave Fong Ling a thumbs up. The food cooked by Sister Ling is getting more and more fragrant and delicious. I don't know who will benefit from it in the future. Fong Yuan, don't you think so? Fong Yuan rolled his eyes and ignored him. Fong Ling cleaned up the bowls and chopsticks angrily and said, "Brother Qingning, eat your food. I want to be a very powerful person like Sister Su Li. No one can marry me." Haydn and others laughed. After a while of laughter, Fong Ling and Haydn went back to their rooms to rest, leaving only Su Li and others. Chu Qingning adjusted his mood and said, "Su Li, all the wines in the yard have been transported here. Those craftsmen don't remember what they built during this time. When will we open for business?" "Open for business?" Su Li pointed to the 3rd floor and shook her head with a smile. "There are only 15 of you. Can you manage the business of the 3rd floor?" Chu Qingning was dumbfounded. Yes, and it was not only the 3rd floor but also the underground. They were too busy. Fong Yuan gently knocked on the table and asked, "Go to the broker house to buy?" Chu Qingning clapped his hands and agreed. "Su Li, what you build is not an ordinary winery. It is obviously not appropriate to recruit workers. The only way to solve the problem now is to go to the broker house to buy people. It is easier to control the life and death of the bought people. Speaking of this, Chu Qingning suddenly narrowed his eyes and whispered, "Speaking of it, if we didn't desperately escape, Fang Yuan and I would have become commodities for people to buy and sell in the broker house. Of course, it is more likely that we will die directly. It's really annoying to think about it." Fang Yuan frowned slightly and motioned Chu Qingning not to continue to say, so as not to expose too much. Su Li suddenly smiled and said, "I am not very clear about the past of you two, but I know your hatred. If you really want to take revenge, you should plan it slowly." Fang Yuan's expression was slightly stiff and he looked at Su Li inquiringly. Did she really know? Or was she deliberately mystifying? Su Li seemed not to see Fang Yuan's expression and decisively finalized the itinerary. "Tomorrow, we will disguise ourselves and go to the broker house together." The next day, the sky was clear, but it was colder. The broker house of the Qinghe town was located in the most marginal area of the North City. After all, the slave trade was not a glorious trade, so the owner of the broker house consciously opened it in the farthest place from the satrap's mansion. Su Li and the other two walked here. They were all dressed in snow-white clothes and their sleeves were fluttering. After taking the bone-changing elixir made by Su Li, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning's height increased a lot. They covered their handsome faces and became ordinary, like two expressionless guards. Su Li's height also increased a few inches. She was dressed in snow-white clothes and wore a light gauze bamboo hat on her head. Her face was covered with a veil. She was very mysterious. As soon as the three people appeared at the door of the broker house, they were immediately greeted respectfully by the manager of the broker house. Just by looking at the guard's clothes, they could tell that there was only one distinguished guest. "May I know your name?" The boss of the broker house slightly bowed and smiled. Chu Qingning immediately snorted and said, "You can call my master, Mr. Su." As he said, Chu Qingning was angry in his heart. Did Su Li deliberately take advantage of him? Why did she set up such an identity? He just made up in the morning and was confused until now. On the other side, Fang Yuan tightened his mouth and his face twitched slightly. Finally, he succeeded in holding back his laughter. The boss of the broker house was also stunned. "Mr. Li?" The person in the middle was obviously a woman, but he didn't care too much about it. He immediately said politely, "It turns out to be Mr. Li. Please come in. May I know who do you want to meet? We have all kinds of slaves, maids, prisoners of war and clansmen. And they have all been educated and absolutely obedient. Let's see who can be the waiter of the winery first." Su Li said softly. Her tone was strange, as if it was covered with a layer of cloth. It was hard to tell whether it was a man or a woman. The boss of the broker house was so scared that his face turned pale. He didn't dare to ask more questions and immediately took the three people into the winery. He finally understood that Mr. Li was definitely a person in Jianghu. Those were all desperate people. He didn't want to make the master unhappy and die on the spot. He was even ready to send the servants for free. Su Li naturally didn't know the thoughts of the boss of the broker house. At this moment, when they entered the house to choose servants, they immediately smelled a faint stench. The boss of the broker house was about to apologize, but he saw that neither Chu Qingning nor Fang Yuan changed their expressions at all. Even Mr. Li seemed to be accustomed to it and didn't have any reaction. "Ada, you can choose some who can be trained." Su Li pointed to the cages with people in them and said softly. Fang Yuan's face darkened, but he still walked over and began to touch them one by one. Su Li said that they should choose the seedlings who could practice martial arts. What they wanted to train was not only waiters but also the embryonic form of a force. The boss of the broker house stood aside and felt cold all over. The young man named Ada walked over and directly touched them one by one, regardless of the filth or hatred. Although there were people regularly cleaning there was still a lot of excrement. Generally, when people came to choose people, they let them out to sea. Mr. Li was so direct. After a while, Fang Yuan came over and shook his head. His voice was transmitted to Su Li's ears. Although there are two seedlings, their spirits have collapsed and they are too servile. They are not worth training. The boss of the broker house saw Fang Yuan shake his head and immediately panicked. He quickly said, "Mr. Li, it doesn't matter if you are not satisfied. We still have 9 such places. If not, we can go to the prisoner camp directly. I have a good relationship with the people there." "That's really helpful." Su Li's voice was indifferent without any joy. She said, "If I can't gather 20 people in the remaining 9 camps, I will bother you to take me to the prisoner camp in person." The boss of the broker house was in a cold sweat. He nodded repeatedly and said, "Of course. It's my honor to serve you." As he said, the boss of the broker house couldn't stop the fear in his heart. He was not so timid even when he met high-ranking officials and nobles. Why was he so scared when he met Mr. Li, who covered his face? It was really weird. In the next 9 camps, Fang Yuan only picked out 6 that were barely acceptable. A group of skinny teenagers followed Su Li and the other 2. There were fear and imagination about the future in their eyes, but they were not numb and defeated. The boss of the broker house had been engaged in the slave trade for many years. At a glance, he could see the spirit of the 6 teenagers. He immediately understood that the servants Su Li wanted to find were not devoid of humanity. There were not many such slaves in the broker house. It seemed that they could only go to the prisoner camp. When he thought of his friendship with the prisoner camp, the boss of the broker house was bleeding in his heart. He bought them with money. There were fewer opportunities to go to the prisoner camp. But there were 3 ruthless people standing beside him. He didn't dare to say no. Taking the 6 slave teenagers, Su Li got in the cart of the broker house. Soon, she went out of the Qinghe town and came to the military camp stationed outside the city. Su Li glanced at it and saw that it was not only a prisoner camp but also a training camp for the official army. Chapter 88. This is a restricted area of the military camp. No one is allowed to enter. The young man shouted coldly, and his sharp eyes swept over the boss of the broker house and the carriage behind him. "Who are you? Tell me your name." When the boss of the broker house saw the face of the deputy general, he immediately looked bitter. How could he meet this little devil? He must have gone out today without looking at the almanac. He was so unlucky. Thinking of this, he had already jumped out of the carriage quickly and approached the young man to flatter. "Third child, call me Deputy General Yen." The young man looked unhappy and corrected him coldly. The boss of the broker house was stunned and immediately changed his address. "Deputy General Yen, I am in charge of the broker house. The distinguished guests of the broker house are sitting in the carriage. If they are not satisfied with the ones in the broker house, I will let them come to the prisoner camp to choose. What do you think?" The young man frowned when he heard the words. The prisoner camp was connected with the broker house. He also knew that it was a secret rule of the military camp, and it was not easy to stop it. However, let them all come down. After I verify their identities, you can go in. The young man pointed at the carriage. The boss of the broker house changed his face slightly and sweated on his forehead. He didn't move for a long time. The young man noticed the strangeness and immediately snorted. He walked a few steps forward to the carriage, pointed the long spear in his hand at the carriage curtain, and said in a deep voice, "People in the carriage, get off." The boss of the broker house was about to cry at the back. He was afraid that the 3 people in the carriage were not happy and killed the young man directly. At that time, even he might lose his head, and the broker house would not be able to open. The next moment, the curtain of the carriage was slowly opened. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning walked out of the carriage and stood beside it. When the young man saw the 2 of them, his eyes were slightly fixed. The pneuma of the 2 of them was indistinct, and he couldn't see through them. That was to say, the cultivation of the 2 of them was at least the same as the acquired 4th hurdle, or even higher. The young man was shocked and couldn't help grasping the long spear in his hand. Such an age and cultivation were enough to be promoted to deputy general in the army. But these 2 people were just servants with others? What was the identity of the person in the carriage? At this moment, Su Li came down from the carriage. The young man stared at Su Li closely, but no matter how he looked, he couldn't detect Su Li's pneuma, as if the masked woman was just an ordinary person. Was it possible for an ordinary person? The vigilance in the young man's eyes blazed, and he unconsciously restrained his tone. May I ask where this miss is from? Seeing that the young man was so scared that his face turned pale, Chu Qingning laughed secretly. He certainly did not expect that Su Li was really an ordinary person, because his and Fang Yuan's cultivation was too confusing. With the guidance of young Master Ling Li for 1 month, plus their hard practice for several months, he and Fang Yuan's cultivation had made great progress. He now stopped at the acquired 7th hurdle, while Fang Yuan went 1 step further and reached the acquired 8th hurdle. Su Li didn't know what Chu Qingning was thinking. She said slowly, "You can call me Mr. Li. I heard that the 3rd son of County Governor Yan is serving in the army. You must be the 3rd son of the Yan family, Yan Zai, right?" Yan Zai was not surprised that his identity was exposed. Even the boss of the broker house knew his identity. This woman had an extraordinary background, so it wasn't strange for her to be well informed. However, this woman had changed her voice to conceal her true appearance. It was obvious that he didn't want to reveal his identity. What he asked before was probably in vain. As for Mr. Li, it was obviously a pseudonym. Thinking of this, he looked serious and said aloud, "Miss, forgive me for being straightforward. According to the rules of the army, if you can't take off your veil, I can't let you enter the camp. Please go back." As soon as he said that, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning looked slightly cold. A little light flashed through Su Li's eyes, but she chuckled and said, "Child Zai, you are just worried that I will do harm to the military camp. If you don't mind the salary, you can go with us. If I really do something wrong, I believe that you can easily stop me with your position in the army, right?" Then, Su Li didn't look at Yan Zai. Her eyes fell on the boss of the broker house. She said in a soft but indisputable voice, "Boss of the broker house, please lead the way." The boss of the broker house suddenly felt endless pressure and subconsciously walked to the prisoner camp. Yan Zai opened his mouth, but he couldn't say anything to stop her. He could only bite the bullet and follow her. He asked himself, if the mysterious Mr. Li really wanted to do something dangerous, did he really have the ability to stop it? A group of people passed through the military camp. When the passing sergeants saw Yan Zai and the team, they immediately let them go. Seeing this situation, Yan Zai realized that he was used by Su Li without a trace. He couldn't help but feel angry. The boss of the broker house saved a lot of money. He was slightly happy and also prayed that Su Li and others came here just to buy people. "Mr. Li, we arrived at the prisoner camp." Su Li smelled the unique familiar smell of the prisoner camp. She smiled coldly and stepped into it. She was more familiar with this place than the boss of the broker house. The air was mixed with a foul and rotten smell. Occasionally, 1 or 2 yellow-faced and emaciated people could be seen climbing out of the tent. They were naked and blue with cold. It was almost disgusting. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning looked slightly cold. They couldn't believe that if they couldn't escape and fell into such a hell on earth, how sober they would be. Yan Zai had vomited. His face was as pale as paper. He couldn't help but ask, "Why is the prisoner camp like this? Is there no one in the army to control it?" The boss of the broker house seemed to have been used to the smell here. His face didn't change at all. He kindly explained to Yan Zai, "Deputy General Yan, you don't know. The prisoners in the prisoner camp are hopeless for the future. You see, those who are not wearing clothes are the weak ones among the prisoners. They are weak, so they naturally become the target of the prisoners. As long as no one is killed, the military camp won't care." Yan Zai fell into silence. As a deputy general in the army, he didn't know as much about the prisoner camp as the boss of the broker house. What he saw today had a great impact on his experience. He followed Su Li all the way to the prisoner camp and didn't say a word. The 4 of them passed by a large purple tent. The rotten smell in their noses was stronger. Chu Qingning couldn't help but ask, "Boss, what is this place? Why is it so stinky?" The boss of the broker house cautiously glanced at Su Li, who was walking in front of him, and whispered, "This is the brothel of the army. The prisoner camp and the brothel of the army are the same. The only difference is that the brothel of the army is a little cleaner." The boss of the broker house emphasized the word cleaner, but no one could tell whether it was cleaner or dirtier. Chu Qingning's face was slightly red. Fortunately, he didn't show any flaws with the appearance-disguising pill. The boss of the broker house couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The two guards of Mr. Lee were really cold-blooded. They didn't change their faces when they heard those words. The boss of the broker house thought his voice was very low, but everyone present actually heard it clearly. Yen Zai looked around and couldn't help but snort coldly. He said, "You are hopeless." Before he finished his words, he saw Su Li's footsteps stagnate and she actually stopped. "Mr. Lee, what's wrong?" The boss of the broker house hurriedly went up to ask. Su Li's eyes were very cold. She pointed to the small tent behind the two purple tents on the right side of the road and said, "Since Adjutant Yen is self-righteous, why don't you go there and have a look?" Yen Zai's expression was cold when he heard that. He didn't think that he was wrong. He said, "A group of women who abandon themselves to degeneration become prostitutes. Does Mr. Lee have other ideas?" Su Li shook her head slightly and didn't answer. Yen Zai snorted coldly. He went directly to the small tent pointed by Su Li and opened it. The next moment, he seemed to be struck by lightning. He was dull and couldn't move anymore. Behind the curtains, pairs of pure and fearful eyes looked at him. In the dim light, he could still see the rows of girls squatting inside. They were all 12 or 13 years old girls. Their bodies were covered in bruises and their clothes were barely covering their bodies. Some of them were even naked, not wearing anything at all. "Child Yen, do you think that these children will abandon themselves to degeneration and understand the desire of human relations?" Su Li's cold voice sounded behind him. Yen Zai slowly raised his head and glimpsed her sarcastic eyes through the veil of the bamboo hat. He was extremely ashamed. These children are the womenfolk of criminal officials. They have done nothing wrong, but they are implicated. They may not be able to leave for the rest of their lives. Abandon themselves to degeneration? If I remember correctly, Child Yen is already 18 years old this year. You are so naive and lovely. After Su Li said it lightly, she floated away. She didn't look at the girls behind the curtain. She didn't think that she was a savior. She was even the opposite. Save people? How many could she save? She was walking on the edge of the knife. How could she be qualified to save people? "Mr. Lee, Child Yen doesn't seem to follow us." The boss of the broker house followed Su Li and looked back every 3 steps. They were getting farther and farther away from the brothel of the military. "Don't worry, boss of the broker house. Don't forget what the purpose of this trip is." Su Li said coldly and sealed the mouth of the boss of the broker house who wanted to continue to ask questions. Shortly after leaving the brothel of the military, Su Li and others finally came to the center of the prisoner camp. Those who stayed here were all prisoners of war who had just entered the camp. Under the arrangement of the boss of the broker house, the officers quickly gathered the prisoners of war in the entire camp. A large group of people stood in the open space in the middle of the camp. Most of them wore exotic costumes. Pairs of eyes full of hatred, curiosity, or fear constantly glanced at Su Li and others who wore bright and beautiful clothes. In the past few months in the prisoner camp, they had learned to be obedient under the oppression of the military camp, at least on the surface. After the arrangement, the boss of the broker house returned to Su Li and whispered, "There are frequent riots in the Nanjiang country, so most of them are prisoners of war of the Nanjiang country. I heard that the Nanjiang country is very powerful in using poisonous insects. Mr. Li, you should be careful." Su Li nodded slightly and let Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning, who couldn't help but go in to pick people. After the two entered this place, their breathing became slightly rapid. It seemed that there were old friends of their Nanjiang country in this group of people. However, Su Li thought carefully and found it was not a coincidence. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning fled to the Desu town one after another, which happened half a year ago. At this time, the prisoners of war on the battlefield were filtered layer by layer. The time when they came to the prisoner camp was almost half a year ago. The time was just right. Chu Qingning almost wanted to step into a ragged woman in the crowd, but when he saw the military camp around him, he took a slight breath and suppressed the palpitation in his heart. Then he started to pick from the first prisoner of war. At this time, he couldn't show the slightest flaw. Fang Yuan's performance was much calmer. He quickly cut in from the other side of Chu Qingning and began to pick. Soon, there were only more than 50 people left in the team of more than 200 prisoners of war. The prisoners who failed to be selected left disappointed. It was not easy for them to meet a master who seemed to have a strong background, but he didn't even pass the first round of screening. At this time, Yen Zai had also come out of the brothel of the military camp and followed a group of girls. Su Li looked at Yen Zai with a smile and immediately motioned Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning to continue to screen. What she wanted were not only fools who could only practice martial arts without brains. Fang Yuan took a simple booklet and picked out more than 20 literate people. More than 30 illiterate people had to leave sadly. Yin Xuetong's little face was as pale as snow. A gust of cold wind blew, and she suddenly shivered and woke up. She raised her head and saw only a dozen people around her. She couldn't help but be stunned. Chapter 89. From the first day Yin Xuetong entered the prisoner camp, people around her kept telling her that it was hopeless to get out of the prisoner camp in this life. Because the most basic requirement for those rich families to buy people was a healthy body, and Yin Xuetong stroked her soft right arm with her left hand. This arm had been broken for more than half a year. The tendons and veins in it were necrotic. Even the best doctor in the Qinghe town couldn't cure it. She couldn't understand why a disabled person like her would be selected. She raised her head and saw the woman standing in the crowd who had never said a word. That was her future master. What was her standard for selecting people? In the third round, Chu Qingning took the dictionary of Dahan and began to test the knowledge of the remaining people more deeply. Some people answered very fluently, some people stammered, and some people were pale and couldn't answer at all. Soon it was Yin Xuetong's turn. She saw that Chu Qingning pointed to the first word of the first line on the first page of the dictionary of Dahan indifferently. She suddenly opened her eyes slightly. She clearly saw that this person turned to the middle to test others. Why did it become the simplest first page when it came to her? The first word was people. Yin Xuetong became more and more confused, but she also knew that it was a good opportunity. She immediately replied nervously, "People are like you and me. They are all sentient beings in the world." Chu Qingning wanted to laugh and cry, but he finally didn't show any expression. He turned the dictionary of Dahan to the middle to test the next person. Soon, the remaining more than 30 people were divided into 3 teams. The first team couldn't answer, the second team answered half of the questions correctly, and the third team answered completely. Chu Qingning returned to Su Li. Su Li glanced at Yin Xuetong in the crowd, who had lost her right arm and was confused and a little excited. A ray of light flashed through her eyes. At this time, Fang Yuan also came. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. Condensed the sound into a line and transmitted the sound's secret. When Yen Zai saw this scene, his pupils instantly shrank. Transmitted the sound's secret was a secret method that could only be mastered by the masters in the acquired 8th hurdle. The origin of these 3 people was really terrible. When he thought that he was only in the acquired 4th hurdle, he couldn't help but feel discouraged. It turned out that compared with the people in the martial arts circle, he was not as good as a servant. Hearing Fang Yuan's words, Su Li nodded slightly. She inadvertently glanced at a skinny teenager in the first team. Then, she took the number plates of more than 30 people and began to pick the people herself. The boss of the broker house bent over and stood beside Su Li. He immediately shouted cleverly, "Those whose names I read stand out immediately." Su Li looked at the boss of the broker house and selected 6 number plates and handed them to him. Zhang Hiniu, Li Sandan, Wu Yajun. Those whose names were called immediately looked happy and stood up. They were all in the team that couldn't answer at all. They didn't expect that they would be chosen, and they were overjoyed. The boss of the broker house stopped when he read the 6th name. It seemed to be over. Yin Xuetong's face turned pale. Sure enough, she was not there. "Mr. Li?" The boss of the broker house held the number and asked with some doubts. The people she called out were not good. Why did she choose these people to buy? Su Li smiled slightly, and her strange voice sounded in front of a group of captives for the first time. "Except for these 6, I want the rest. Boss of the broker house, calculate the price." The boss of the broker house looked at the remaining 27 people and was suddenly dumbfounded. Almost all of them were bought. In addition to the 6 he had brought, there were a total of 33 people. Big business. The boss of the broker house was happy. Suddenly he thought of the origin of the 3 people and couldn't help but feel bitter. He said honestly, "Mr. Lee, the 6 boys of the broker house are not valuable. I can make the decision to give them to you. But you have to pay a sum of money for the captives. One person is 100 taels. 27 people, that is 2,700 taels of silver." Su Li nodded slightly and gestured to Chu Qingning. The latter immediately took out 27 notes with a denomination of 100 taels of silver and handed them to the officer. Seeing that Su Li was so forthright, the boss of the broker house immediately smiled. He helped the military camp to get so much money. His benefits were far greater than those of the 6 boys who were slaves. The officer was also happy to get the hot notes. He arranged 2 large carriages for Su Li to go back. Before leaving, Su Li looked at Yen Zai, who was a little distressed, and said slowly, "If you can't make up your mind, it's better to let them choose their own future." Yen Zai was slightly stunned when he heard that. He was about to ask what Su Li meant, but he saw that she had gone away with the carriage. After coming to his sense, Yen Zai looked at a group of girls around him with eyes full of pleading. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He was really impulsive. As soon as they left the captives' camp, a group of young boys and girls sitting in the carriage immediately became restless. Pairs of eyes looked out and greedily breathed the air outside. Seeing that Chu Qingning was sitting on the edge of the carriage door and pretending to take a nap, the boy sitting in the innermost part of the carriage immediately wanted to escape. But as soon as he turned around, before he had time to climb out of the window, a knife suddenly flashed, and the tip of a knife was already against his neck. If he moved an inch further, he would see blood. The cold feeling from the blade immediately gave him goosebumps, and his whole body was stiff and couldn't move. Chu Qingning snorted coldly and took back the long knife. He said lightly, "If anyone dares to escape again, I will not be merciful. Master only wanted to buy 20 people. Now there are 13 more. It's not a big deal if 1 or 2 people die." As soon as he said this, the people sitting in the carriage suddenly became quiet. They just got out of that damn place and no one wanted to die on the road. Seeing that everyone was quiet, Chu Qingning sat down again, but he was so angry in his heart. Su Li definitely did it on purpose. She actually didn't let him stay in Xuedong's carriage. Thinking of this, he glanced at the thin boy sitting in the middle of the crowd, who seemed to be struggling to raise his head. He couldn't help but feel strange. He seemed to have seen this face somewhere, but he couldn't remember. Who was he to Fang Yuan? At this moment, the same escape happened in the previous carriage. Fang Yuan silently cut off an arm of the person who escaped, and the whole carriage suddenly became quieter than the captives' camp. Yin Xuetong shrank in the innermost part of the carriage with a pale face. She felt something was wrong. The person who bought them turned out to be from the martial arts circle. She used to hear people in her family that some evil families used people to do experiments, and the means were extremely cruel. She couldn't have been bought by that kind of family, right? Otherwise, why would they even want a severed arm? At the thought of this, Yin Xuetong's face became paler and bloodless. She just escaped from the wolves and entered the tiger's mouth? Just when Yin Xuetong was thinking about it and almost wanted to commit suicide, the carriage finally stopped. "Everyone get off in turn. Don't make noise." Hearing Fang Yuan's voice, the 2 carriages were silent for a moment. The first one to get off was the skinny boy. He climbed out of the carriage with difficulty. When he saw the gorgeous building in front of him, his expression changed instantly. With the first one, the remaining 32 servants got off the carriage one after another. When they saw the luxurious and exquisite 3-story building, they were all shocked. Were they going to live here in the future? Su Li and the others didn't stop and walked into the restaurant. After a while, Haydn and others came out. They were originally beggars and were trained by Chu Qingning and Ling Li successively. At this moment, they had already shed the inferiority of beggars. They were all calm and composed, quite like disciples of big sections. They were all wearing the uniform of the Lin Li building designed by Su Li herself. There were two kinds of clothes. One was the ordinary maid's clothes, which were light blue and pink. The other was the black and gold steward's clothes worn by Haydn and others. The word, leanly, was embroidered with gold thread on the right chest. It was simple but imposing. Many of the prisoners of war who had never seen the world couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. Yin Xuetong and the skinny youth's eyes flashed at the same time. They could tell that these youths all had cultivations. Haydn had never been so glorious as today. He was very happy. However, he thought that he had even met young master. Naturally, he wouldn't be frightened by such a small scene. Then he said loudly, "You are in the Leanly building today. Those who pass the test and training will become the fellows of the Leanly building in the future. Come with me." Haydn led a group of people to bypass the Leanly building and came to the open space behind the Leanly building. There were a lot of bluestone bricks and wood. Haydn coughed slightly and pointed to the bricks and wood. He said, "This is your first test. Whoever can build his residence can pass the test and stay. During this period, the Leanly building will provide you with food so that you won't starve to death. As for the rest, you have to rely on yourselves. There are guards around this place. If you want to escape, don't blame me for being merciless." Haydn's words were not pleasant to hear, but everyone's eyes gradually brightened. There was something called hope in their hearts. They had been marked as prisoners of war. If they escaped, they would be killed immediately. They even thought about how miserable their future would be. However, they didn't expect that they would be bought as fellows. They would have food and shelter and even wouldn't be restricted in the future. Such a good thing couldn't be found easily. Almost without any hesitation, everyone immediately picked up the bricks and wood and began to build the house they would live in the future. The skinny boy's eyes burst with indescribable light. He grabbed a stone and was about to lift it up. However, he didn't move for a long time, which made others laugh. But the skinny boy seemed to have not heard it and continued to struggle with the stone. Yin Xuetong gritted her teeth and pushed the stone with one hand. However, her right hand drooped. She couldn't pile up the stone. How could she build a house like this? Many people's eyes fell on the two people. Where there were people, there would be a competition. The skinny boy and Yin Xuetong seemed to be the two worst among the 33 people. If there was no accident, they would soon be driven out of the Leanly building and become beggars on the street or go back to the prisoner camp where life was worse than death. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Haydn to reappear. He pointed at the skinny boy and Yin Xuetong and shouted, "You too, come here." The skinny boy was sweating and panting like a tuberculosis ghost. It seemed that he would die in the next second. Hearing Haydn's shout, he dragged his feet and slowly walked over. A trace of anxiety finally appeared in his silent eyes. His weak voice came into Haydn's ears. "There is still a long time before the appointed date. I can build the house." He finally saw the chance to live. He didn't want to give up. Yin Xuetong was also pale. She held her right arm and her beautiful eyes were full of begging. Haydn looked strange, but he still didn't say anything. He waved his hand and said, "Come with me." Chapter 90. Haydn passed through the luxuriously decorated hall on the first floor and entered the room where the supervisor rested. Then he turned to the bookcase and gently twisted it. The bookcase immediately moved away slowly and revealed a secret door. The emaciated young man and Yin Xuetong who followed him were slightly shocked. The situation seemed to be different from what they thought. They knew the secret of the dark door. If they wanted to leave, they must die first. "Come with me, you two." As Haydn spoke, he also muttered the words like luck, which made the two people confused. They could only follow Haydn and go on. The underground addendum did not appear in their imagination. After the three people passed through a stone path, their sight suddenly became clear. They came to a bright central room. If there were no windows around, the emaciated young man and Yin Xuetong almost thought that they were on the ground. After Haydn sent them here, he asked them to wait for a while. Then he left alone and closed the door. Yin Xuetong and the emaciated young man looked at each other and saw the doubts in each other's eyes. In the current situation, the two of them were just lowly servants. Who would want to see them? Tap, tap, tap. Suddenly, there was a sound of footsteps. The emaciated young man and Yin Xuetong turned their heads at the same time and saw Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning coming together in a hurry. They didn't even have time to remove the disguise effect. Seeing the two people coming, the emaciated young man and Yin Xuetong were shocked. When they were about to salute, they heard Chu Qingning said with a smile and anger, "Xuetong, why do you lower your head? Don't you even recognize me?" Yin Xuetong was flustered and looked up at Chu Qingning. She felt that his voice was very familiar. But when she saw Chu Qingning's face, she couldn't think of anything for a while. Fang Yuan snorted and picked up a pot of tea and poured it on Chu Qingning's face. The tea was still hot. Chu Qingning screamed in pain. "Fang Yuan, you must have done it on purpose. How dare you vent your anger on me? Are you even human? I also suffered a loss, okay?" Hearing the name, Fang Yuan, the emaciated young man's eyes lit up immediately. He was no longer silent but full of excitement. Fang Yuan wiped the disguise on his face with water and took a deep breath. He smiled and said, "Moo, long time no see. Big brother, it's really you." The emaciated young man shouted excitedly as he stood up. Suddenly, his expression changed and he bent down to cough violently. Soon, he coughed so much that blood came out of the corner of his mouth. With his current weakened body, he couldn't withstand such intense emotions. Fang Yuan's expression changed. He immediately left the addendum with Fang Mu in his arms, leaving Yin Xuetong and Chu Qingning looking at each other. Yin Xuetong's beautiful eyes were full of tears. She stared blankly at Chu Qingning, whose face was a little red because of the heat. The next moment, she couldn't help but plunge into Chu Qingning's chest. "Qingning, I thought I would never see you again. They all said that you're dead." Chu Qingning let the person in his arms cry bitterly. His eyes were full of affection. He closed his eyes and sighed with satisfaction. He also thought that he would never see her again, but fate was so miraculous that they met again. Gently stroking Yin Xuetong's soft right arm, Chu Qingning said in an unprecedentedly gentle voice, "Don't be afraid. Everything will be fine." Feeling the slight pain from her right arm, Yin Xuetong's eyes dimmed slightly. Immediately, she was intoxicated in the tranquil atmosphere and didn't think about anything else. In the urgent footsteps, more blood spilled from Fang Mu's mouth, but he smiled brightly. If he didn't get angry, he could probably live longer. But he didn't expect that he could see his big brother in the end. He had no regrets. "Big brother, bury me here after I die. We are all homeless people. How about letting me stay with you?" Fang Mu kept talking while bleeding, and his blood dyed Fang Yuan's arm red. The blue veins on Fang Yuan's forehead were exposed. He was so anxious that he shouted coldly, "Shut up. You can still live. She can save you." "Save me?" Fang Mu smiled. As he smiled, his eyes gradually became lax, and he was about to close completely. His breathing instantly became weak. At this time, Fang Yuan finally arrived at Su Li's room. Bang! He kicked open the door of Su Li's room, and his eyes were full of begging, "Help!" After 5 minutes, Su Li took back the last needle, and Fang Mu's breathing also stabilized. Fang Yuan breathed a long sigh of relief. "This guy is lucky. If you come a little later, he will go to hell." Su Li sorted out the medicine cabinet. He once used an extremely powerful backfire method. Now his body is empty, and the 5 elements are in disorder. He is extremely weak. Even if he is saved, he can only live for a few months. Fang Yuan looked gloomy when he heard the words, "It's the secret method of exploding poisonous insects of my Fang family. He consumes his life in exchange for a moment of strength." "Su Li, is he really hopeless?" Fang Yuan asked this question with a fluke. Unexpectedly, Su Li nodded naturally and said, "Of course, but it will cost a lot. Why should I save him?" Fang Yuan's face brightened, and he didn't care about Su Li's tone at all. "What do I have to pay?" He had been used to the mode of getting along with Su Li. Just now, in order to let Su Li take in Fang Mu and Yin Xuetong, he and Chu Qingning paid different prices. Su Li turned her eyes, tilted her head and smiled. "Do you know what Chu Qingning paid in order to let me treat Yin Xuetong's arm?" Looking at Su Li's clear eyes, Fang Yuan felt cold and asked subconsciously, "What?" To work for me for a lifetime. Su Li smiled sweetly, and her tone suddenly became cold. No matter what I say, he will do it without hesitation, even if he will die. And he will do it without hesitation. That idiot! Fang Yuan scolded secretly. He knew without thinking that the guy had lost his mind for his woman. He just promised Su Li that he would work for Su Li for 10 years to the best of his ability. He was the first to join Su Li, so he knew it better than anyone else. Su Li was not a good person. On the contrary, she was extremely good at calculation. She was an open and above-board villain who had never hidden her naked ambition. She must have her own purpose to take in so many people. From the night when he killed people, she said, there will be more and more terrible dangers in the future. But so what? Fang Yuan suddenly smiled. Even without these rules and regulations, he was willing to go through fire and water for Su Li without hesitation. Then I will also work for you for a lifetime, like him. Fang Yuan's tone was very calm. He didn't gnash his teeth like Chu Qingning. Su Li looked at Fang Yuan and was slightly stunned. Then she immediately smiled brightly. In this way, I also have 2 real subordinates, which is really a good feeling. Su Li's eyes flashed. She suffered a loss in her previous life because she was alone. If she had a force in her hand, how could she fall into the situation of death by dismemberment? She even had no power to avenge her disabled husband. Fang Yuan twitched his mouth and showed helplessness. Looking at Su Li's happy smile, he felt a little distressed for some reason. I exchanged my freedom for your happiness, but it still can't stop the sadness in your heart. In this case, I will cure him now, so that you won't regret temporarily. Then I will suffer losses. Su Li held the silver needle in Fang Mu's abdomen with one hand. A wisp of green light suddenly appeared and penetrated into Fang Mu's body along the silver needle. Fang Mu's face immediately became ruddy at a speed visible to the naked eye, and his breathing became strong and powerful. If this scene was seen by other doctors, they would definitely exclaim that there was one more miracle-working doctor in the world. Fang Yuan stood aside and his eyes showed shock. After all, he was not a doctor. It was the first time for him to touch this kind of power full of vitality. But even so, it did not prevent him from understanding the preciousness of this power. It can actually supplement the 5 elements of the human body. What kind of magical power is it? Su Li has never used it before. Is it the power that she realized recently? But Su Li is obviously an ordinary person. For a moment, Fang Yuan's vision of Su Li, which was slightly clear, became blurred again. He found that even if he was beside Su Li, he still couldn't see the real details of Su Li. Except for her origin, no one could see the real details of Su Li. After a quarter of an hour, Su Li withdrew her hand. Her face became pale and her breath was slightly rapid. She said slowly, I am not capable enough to cure this sequela at one time. Let him have a good rest in these 7 days. When he is fully adapted, I will carry out the next treatment. It is estimated that he will be able to return to normal and start practicing again after 3 treatments. Fang Yuan was speechless. Was it not capable enough? If it were other doctors, they would definitely ask him to prepare for Fang Mu's funeral. Su Li only needed 1 month to cure him. She was simply a miracle-working doctor. I didn't expect that your medical skills and poison skills are equally powerful. Fang Yuan rarely sighed, but Su Li smiled sweetly and said, You are wrong. My medical skills are far worse than the poison skills. If I want to do it, the entire Qinghe town will instantly become a dead city. Fang Yuan's scalp was numb. He really wanted to ask if it was true. But he saw that Su Li had already packed up the medicine box and ordered, The road is full of blood. Don't forget to clean it up. Looking at the pool of blood on the ground, Fang Yuan was speechless for a while. Fang Mu frowned. When the light returned to his eyes, he sat up with a quiver. Looking at his slightly plump and white slender hands, he was suddenly stunned. I am not dead? Fang Yuan turned back and knocked on his head. Eldest brother said that you will not die, so you will not die. You bastard! Do you know that I even lost my life for you? Fang Mu was suddenly stunned. He covered his head and repeatedly begged for mercy. After that, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning met. Seeing that Chu Qingning and Yin Xuedong were so attached to each other, Fang Yuan suddenly felt sick. When Chu Qingning saw Fang Mu, whose face was ruddy and body was much stronger, he immediately laughed and said, "Hey, boy, don't vomit blood? I thought you were going to die just now." Fang Mu scratched his head embarrassedly. "Eldest brother Chu, you must be joking. Do you still remember me? I am Fang Mu of the Fang family. I am a collateral relative, but eldest brother Fang Yuan treats me very well." Chu Qingning touched his chin and nodded. "You were so thin before. Fortunately, Fang Yuan could recognize you." Yin Xuedong looked at Fang Mu with her eyes full of curiosity. She just saw that Fang Mu kept vomiting blood. She did not expect that after a while, he was full of vigor. "Xuedong, now you can rest assured. The owner of this winery is a miracle-working doctor. She can definitely cure your hand." Chu Qingning guaranteed. For this hand, he had sacrificed his life. According to Su Li's character, if she couldn't cure it, she would definitely not let him agree to such an excessive request. "Is it Mr. Li?" Yin Xuetong asked timidly. "Both of you are his servants. It's not good to talk like this, right?" Chu Qingning's face darkened, and Fang Yuan immediately smiled. At this moment, Su Li came in from outside the door. Under the curious gaze of Fang Mu and Yin Xuetong, she sat at the table and poured herself a cup of tea. Chapter 91. Hearing Su Li's words, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning were helpless at the same time. They didn't know what she wanted to do. But since she asked them to go out, Su Li must have something to say to Fang Mu and Yin Xuetong alone. Chu Qingning stood up first, scratched his head, and gave Yin Xuetong a reassuring look. Then he walked out of the underground addendum with Fang Yuan and closed the door. Fang Mu and Yin Xuetong looked at each other and were shocked to see Su Li, who seemed to be younger than them. She said, "Was she Mr. Li? Was Mr. Li actually a young girl?" Yin Xuetong couldn't help but compare their heights. It seemed that Mr. Li was a little taller than Su Li in the daytime. It was strange. Su Li drank the tea and looked at Fang Mu and Yin Xuetong with a smile. She said first, "For the sake of Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning, I will cure you too, and the Lin Li building will also take you in. However, all these come with conditions." Fang Mu and Yin Xuetong were nervous. What conditions? They didn't know that Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan agreed to Su Li's unreasonable request for them. At this moment, they were perturbed. They walked all the way from the battlefield to the prisoner camp. They knew that there was no free lunch in the world. "It's very simple." Su Li pointed to Fang Mu and said, "After your injury is healed, I will prescribe medicine to restore your cultivation as soon as possible. After that, you will work for me like Fang Yuan. Usually, you will stay in the Lin Li building to be responsible for safety. Is there any problem?" Fang Mu was shocked and stammered excitedly, "I can continue to practice?" Su Li's eyebrows flashed coldly and she said lightly, "Do you think I will take in a waste?" Fang Mu shrank his neck and shook his head quickly. He couldn't help but have a trace of fear for Su Li. The girl in front of him seemed to be about the same age as him, but the inexplicable momentum she exuded made people unconsciously feel frightened. Seeing Fang Mu's reaction, Su Li's expression instantly recovered. She smiled warmly and said, "Then I will take it that you agree. Fang Mu, work hard in the future." Fang Mu agreed in a muddle-headed way. Although he felt that something was wrong, his eldest brother, Fang Yuan, was here, so he felt very peaceful. Besides, his life was saved by Mr. Li. Even if he died for the Lin Li building, what was the harm? "You're next." Su Li's sharp eyes fell on Yin Xuetong, which made Yin Xuetong's ruddy face turn pale. She said, "Within a month, I will make you recover like Fang Mu. In the future, you will be the shopkeeper of the Lin Li building. Is there any problem?" "What? I'm the shopkeeper?" Yin Xuetong exclaimed. She couldn't think straight for a while. She had only been here for a day, and she was just a slave. How could this girl directly give her such an important position as the shopkeeper? "What, you don't want to?" Su Li tilted her head and said strangely, "Chu Qingning assured me that you have shown talent in overall planning before. You can be the shopkeeper of the Lin Li building with ease." Could it be that he was lying? Then I'll have to settle the score with him. In Shuetong shook her head quickly and denied. Then she firmly nodded and said, I will run the Leanly building well and won't let you down. Su Li smiled slightly and stood up. She glanced at the two people who were confused and said, My name is Su Li. You two remember it. Then, Su Li left, leaving the two people who hadn't recovered from the series of fright. After a long time, Fong Mu said with difficulty and sighed deeply, What a terrible momentum. She is obviously of the same generation. Is she Mr. Li? In Shuetong had the same feeling and nodded repeatedly. But a trace of doubt flashed in her eyes. Because Su Li neither denied nor admitted that she was Mr. Li from the beginning to the end. Were Su Li and Mr. Li the same person? She and Fong Mu still needed time to understand each other. After today, Fong Mu and In Shuetong never appeared in front of the other 31 people. Everyone thought that the two people had been secretly killed by the Leanly building. So, they acted more quickly for fear that they would be like them. In less than half a month, rows of black brick and tile-roofed houses were built behind the Leanly building, which looked very neat. After the houses were built, everyone was so tired that they collapsed on the ground. But with the nutrition provided by the Leanly building, their physical fitness was improved. They wouldn't feel very tired even if they worked in an ordinary restaurant for a day. Haydn appeared in the backyard on time. He clapped his hands and said loudly, Very good. Congratulations on passing the first round of test. According to the construction speed of the houses, I will give you a number. When you work in the winery, you can use the number instead of your name. Several people who still had some strength struggled to sit up. Their faces were full of joy. 3 days later, on the 15th day of the first lunar month, the Leanly building will open. You don't have time to rest. You should be familiar with the business of the winery in these 3 days. Now, go to the bathhouse to take a bath and start the training immediately. Hearing the order of Haydn, everyone dragged their tired bodies to stand up. But they stared at the new clothes in the hands of the person behind Haydn. They couldn't hide the excitement in their eyes. They didn't remember how long they hadn't taken a bath and put on new clothes. Even if it was just the clothes of the waiters, they felt very happy. The bathhouse was divided into men and women. Among the 31 people, less than half were women. So, it didn't cause chaos. The first teenager who took a bath climbed out of the bathhouse to dry himself. When he touched the clothes that had been prepared on the side, he was stunned. These clothes are actually silk instead of linen? The teenager was shocked. What was the origin of the Leanly building? They even passed silk to the lowliest servants. They were so rich. The waiters were busy in the winery and would definitely dirty their clothes. It was really a waste to use such good cloth to make clothes for the waiters. On the other side, the women also took a bath and put on new clothes with joy. They didn't think too much. They just felt that the silk clothes were really comfortable. After everyone changed their clothes, their faces suddenly changed. They stood in front of Haydn again. Haydn nodded. Boss and others were really smart. The people they chose were all very good. Besides, they could persist in the test. Their willpower was also qualified. The men were left to assign their tasks. All the women went to the kitchen with Fong Ling. Fong Ling taught them the basic process of processing ingredients. Learning was a process. It couldn't be accomplished overnight. Su Li's idea was to let this group of people cope with the chaos when the winery just opened. As for their abilities, they could be cultivated slowly in the future. As long as there was no problem with their brains, she had ways to squeeze their potential and make these people progress quickly. After all, she had been the hierarch of the Inma cult for a period of time in her previous life. When a group of people hurriedly adapted to the work of the winery, it was finally the 15th day of the first lunar month, the Lantern Festival. As the first full moon night of the new year, the Lantern Festival was naturally one of the most important festivals in the Dahan country. The entire Qinghe town was bustling early. Every street was decorated with lanterns and ribbons. People began to arrange lanterns for the Lantern Festival. Various folk performances were also being prepared. The Leanly building was also decorated with lanterns and ribbons. A group of teenagers in brand new clothes wiped the inside and outside of the building again and again. There were more and more people on the street. Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan wore masks and danced lions in front of the door. Their movements were extraordinary. They played the lions vividly. Many people stopped to watch and applauded. Crackle, crackle. A series of firecrackers suddenly sounded outside the door. The door of the Linli building was opened. 3 maids walked out from both sides and bowed to wait quietly. Then Yin Xuetong, who wore a white velvet skirt and was carefully dressed, walked out of the door with a smile. She said loudly, "People of the Qinghe town, I am the shopkeeper of the Linli building. Nice to meet you. Today is the Lantern Festival and the opening day of the Linli Bureau. All the drinks are uniformly discounted. There are also fine wine and snacks for free. The Linli building welcomes all the drinkers." The attention of the people who were watching the lion dance was immediately attracted. Seeing Yin Xuetong's fair and delicate face, many people thought that she was so beautiful. Then they couldn't help but be surprised when they heard that she was the shopkeeper. The woman looked only 15 or 16 years old. How could she be the shopkeeper of the Linli building? At this time, they also found that both the shopkeeper and the servants of the Linli building were all teenagers and quite energetic. It turns out that the Linli building is a winery. The name is really elegant. Today, the drinks are discounted and the fine wine is free. I will go in and have a taste. Let's go. Let's go in together. I have a lot of friends who usually drink with me. I will go back and call them together. For a time, a large number of drinkers poured into the restaurant. Seeing the chic and gorgeous decoration of the restaurant, they were amazed. They had never seen such a well-decorated winery. It was a kind of enjoyment to just sit in it without drinking. After watching, the customers finally noticed the 2 extremely simple signs hanging behind the counter. Osmanthus wine, 1 tael per pot. Osmanthus cake, 500 taels per plate. Only 2 dishes. All the customers who came in were dumbfounded. Such a big restaurant only had 2 dishes. Was it a joke? Is it a child who has nothing to do, so he opened it to play tricks on people? The discounted wine is actually sold for 1 tael per pot. It is more expensive than the restaurant. Is the original price 10 taels? What is Osmanthus wine? Why haven't I heard of this kind of wine before? For a time, all the people who came in to join in the fun were confused. They sat in the restaurant and didn't know what to do. No one ordered. The scene was quiet and fell into an awkward silence. Yin Xuetong didn't change her expression. She winked at the person secretly. Immediately, a child of a rich family in disguise shouted, "Who cares what it is? Just ask him to come and have a taste. Waiter, give me a pot of Osmanthus wine and a plate of Osmanthus cake. Don't forget to send the free Osmanthus cake up." As soon as he said that, there was a burst of laughter in the restaurant, and the atmosphere was relaxed. Many people began to order. However, most people only wanted to have a taste of the free Osmanthus cake. As for the Osmanthus wine, which cost 1 tael per pot, they would not consider it until others had tasted it. Soon, the Osmanthus cake and Osmanthus wine ordered by the person were served. The servant who pretended to be a child of a rich family casually poured himself a cup of Osmanthus wine. The clear and sticky wine with a little golden color gently rippled in the cup. Chapter 92. In the cold winter, the wine cup was steaming. The fragrance of Osmanthus slowly spread in the building. The experienced drinkers nearby couldn't help but swallow their saliva and watch the rich child drink it. Yin Su didn't expect that he would have such a good thing on the first day of his work. Although he had a high requirement for acting skills, he used to cheat in Nanjiang country. Later, he was caught by the government and then he joined the army as a cannon fodder. When the wine entered his throat, the imagined spiciness did not spread from his heart. Instead, it was replaced by a soft sweetness. The taste was smooth, as if it was silk instead of wine. The strong fragrance of Osmanthus penetrated into his limbs and bones. The pores all over his body seemed to open, and he felt extremely comfortable. It's not wine. It's clearly an addictive poison. Yin Su drank a cup and was a little drunk. At this moment, he had forgotten that he was still acting. He picked up an osmanthus cake and stuffed it into his mouth without caring about his image. His whole mouth was immediately wrapped by a completely different sweetness. He chewed it carefully. It was soft and oily, sweet but not greasy. The fragrance of rice was wrapped in the fragrance of osmanthus. The deliciousness was clearly layered. The sweetness was mixed with the freshness, which was memorable. Su was totally intoxicated. He didn't need any pretentious performance. His expression had already explained everything. Many people couldn't help but order. They wanted to know why Su became like that just after drinking a cup of wine and eating a piece of osmanthus cake. As pots of osmanthus wine were served on the table, the fragrance of osmanthus in the entire winery was more intense. The real good wine never needed any publicity. After tasting the first sip, those old drunkards were immediately ecstatic, as if they got the most precious treasure. After drinking one by one, they excitedly walked out of the restaurant. Obviously, they went to show off to their drinking friends. Shuetong could imagine how lively the Linli building would be tomorrow. "It's delicious. I want to drink more," Su shouted with a red face. Obviously, he forgot his identity. Shuetong shook her head and quickly asked someone to help him out. She couldn't help but smile slightly. For the sake that he successfully opened up the situation of the Linli building, she didn't blame him for drinking indiscriminately. The osmanthus wine alone is enough to make the Linli building famous in the Qinghe town. But the dishes are a little monotonous. I don't know if Mr. Li has other ideas. At night, the Lantern Festival was bustling with noise and excitement. People could smell the faint fragrance of osmanthus in the streets close to the Linli building. More and more people came because of the smell, which made the peddlers on the street happy. Su Li stood on the roof and looked at the lively scene downstairs. A smile flashed on her calm face. Shuetong's ability was good. She didn't need to worry about the Linli building at ordinary times, which was a surprise. However, she looked towards the south of Qinghe City. In a few more days, some people with ulterior motives would make a move. On the second day, the number of drinkers who came to the Linli building to taste the wine was more than twice that of yesterday. The waiters kept serving them. Soon, the second floor of the winery was full. The faces of the customers who came yesterday changed slightly when they saw the sign on the wall. They seemed to have forgotten something very important. Osmanthus wine, 10 taels per pot. Osmanthus cake, 5 taels per plate. That's right. Yesterday, the shopkeepers said that drinks would be sold at a 10% discount on the first day of business. Today, the original price has been restored. What's going on? Old Li, 10 taels a pot? It's enough for me to go to Laifu Inn to drink 10 bottles of bamboo wine. Old Li, I came here because of your bragging. I didn't expect that you cheated me. Tell me, how much did you charge the winery? We treat you as a friend. How can you treat us like this? For a time, the voices of criticism were constantly in the building. Many people like Old Li were extremely angry. Anyone who brought friends to share good things with good intentions was misunderstood. He would never feel good. But the more it was so, the more Old Li wanted to prove that he was right. Are you kidding me? Am I that kind of person? Old Li looked angry. He waved his hand and said, "Waiter, give me 3 pots of osmanthus wine. Today I will show you what real wine is. The bamboo wine of Laifu Inn is bullshit. Compared with the osmanthus wine of the Linli building, it can't even be called wine." Looking at the angry face of his old friend, many drinkers who were about to leave suddenly stopped and turned back to sit down again. Old Li, I will taste the magical osmanthus wine that you said. It makes you praise it so much. As early as in the yard, Haydn brewed a large number of osmanthus wine. After the original wine was diluted, it could be directly served on the table. It was very fast. Before Old Li and others waited for a long time, the waiter put 3 pots of hot wine on the table and a plate of osmanthus cake. Old Li was stunned and said hurriedly, "Wait, I didn't order osmanthus cake." The waiter immediately smiled and said, "Our master said that you are a person who loves wine. This plate of osmanthus cake is a bonus." Old Li's eyes were wet when he heard that. Looking at the plate of osmanthus cake, he felt that he was about to cry. "Thank your shopkeeper for me. The waiter didn't correct the difference between shopkeeper and master. He nodded and went away. Su Li stood on the top floor and watched this scene. Her smile was full of deep meaning. When a person was doubted and denied, even if he was only given a small favor, he would remember it deeply and immediately regard the person who gave the gift as a confidant. Sure enough, people's hearts were so fragile. For people who loved wine, the power of wine had no upper limit. When a group of old drunkards drank the osmanthus wine, yesterday's scene immediately repeated, and it was even crazier. Old Li, I was wrong. This wine should only be available in heaven. How can we smell it in the human world? Old Li, you hurt me. After I drank the osmanthus wine, I thought of the green bamboo wine. I didn't know how to drink it. It's really not expensive to sell such sweet wine for 10 taels of silver for a pot. The Leanly building, I want to live here. I still like the spicy taste. I hope that the Leanly building can produce new wine as soon as possible. Waiter, pack 2 more plates of osmanthus cake. I want to take them back to my wife to taste. For a time, the restaurant was constantly praised and set off a buying frenzy. In just half a day, hundreds of pots of osmanthus wine and thousands of plates of osmanthus cake were sold. Yin Xuetong was so scared that she hurriedly announced that today's inventory was insufficient and the restaurant would be open tomorrow. Although the inventory of the winery was sufficient, and the dried osmanthus flower was also collected in several warehouses last autumn, it couldn't stand such a crazy buying. Moreover, she also knew that there must be speculators among the customers. Otherwise, no matter how good the reputation of the winery was, it could not sell so much in just one day. However, I still need to tell Su Li about it. Thinking of this, Yin Xuetong went to the attic on the top floor. Before she knocked on the door, she heard a voice coming from inside. I already know the specific things. In the future, the osmanthus wine and osmanthus cake will be limited and can't be bought in large quantities. The specific quantity is up to you. Yin Xuetong was shocked, and then her scalp was slightly numb. It turned out that the current situation of the winery had been seen by her, but she didn't say it clearly. If she didn't come today, would the shopkeeper be changed tomorrow? Yes, I see. Yin Xuetong didn't open the door. She obediently sat outside the door and turned to go downstairs. At the same time, she secretly decided to do better than before. That night, in the underground addendum, Chu Qingning, Yin Xuetong, Fang Yuan and Fang Mu gathered together. Xuetong, tell me how much money the winery has made these days. Chu Qingning's eyes were shining, and he looked like a miser. Yin Xuetong rolled her eyes at him and said slowly, the osmanthus wine we are selling now is diluted 100 times. The net profit is 9 taels per pot. The profit of osmanthus cake is a little lower, about 3 taels per plate. Today, we have sold more than 500 pots of osmanthus wine and more than 1,200 plates of osmanthus cake. Excluding the odd amount, the Leanly building has made at least 8,000 taels. Thinking of this, Yin Xuetong couldn't help but take a deep breath. The profit of osmanthus wine was terrible. Moreover, wine was not like dishes. Even if people drank it all the time, they wouldn't get tired of it. People who liked to drink even needed to make a little wine every day to feel happy. Unlike dishes, if people ate it every day, they would get tired of it. In this way, as soon as the Leanly building opened, it became a money tree that made 8,000 taels a day. Fang Mu's eyes were wide open, and he couldn't help drooling. It turned out that the eldest brother had such a powerful backer. No wonder his cultivation rose sharply. He reached the acquired 8th hurdle in less than half a year. It was much faster than in the family. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning had no reaction. They had already seen Su Li's ability to make money, so they were not surprised by the money. Su Li didn't spend a penny before, and she extorted 400,000 taels from Su Huanli. Then, the Leanly building was established. Compared with that, the daily income of 8,000 taels was a piece of cake. How does Su Li think? She not only cooks delicious dishes, but also brews wine so well. Chu Qingning smiled and couldn't help but pat Fang Yuan's back. He said, in this way, we won't suffer any loss if we follow her. Fang Yuan rolled his eyes. Yin Shuetong and Fang Mu were both confused. Plus, what riddles were they talking about? At this moment, in the study of a magnificent mansion in the south city of the Qinghe town. Master, many of the restaurants you chose have agreed to transfer. The middle-aged man who looked like a steward bowed and said respectfully. Beside the desk in front of him, a handsome young man with a cold expression and dressed in luxurious golden clothes was staring fixedly at the ancient scroll in his hand. From the back of his hand, one could vaguely discern that this was a cultivation technique illustration. Hearing the housekeeper's words, the young man snorted and said slowly, "Tell me, which restaurants are there?" The housekeeper quickly replied, "There are 3 in total. One is the Laifu Inn in the center of the city. The owner of this inn is not famous, so he naturally dares not to offend you, master. The other 2 are the Yuelai Inn in the east of the city and the Huamen Inn in the west of the city. These 2 are old inns that have been operating for many years. Their locations are a little remote, but they are good places with stable traffic." The young man nodded slightly and seemed to be satisfied. He looked up and asked, "Then, how about the income of the inn?" "The Laifu Inn is the highest. It can earn 3,000 taels every day." The housekeeper answered fluently, "The other 2 are 2,500 taels and 2,700 taels respectively." The young man frowned slightly. He put down the scroll in his hand and stood up slowly. His eyes were as cold as lightning. "You have inquired for so long, but you only found 3 rubbish restaurants for me?" The housekeeper was suddenly shocked and knelt down. "Master, I have tried my best. The other restaurants and inns are supported by the rich and powerful families like us. They are supported by senior officials. We really can't afford to offend them." The young man sneered. "I promised my father that since I want to have achievements in business, I can't do it on a small scale. The 3 inns you mentioned don't even have the ability to earn 5,000 taels a day. How can they match my identity?" Chapter 93. "Oh." The young man raised his eyebrows and showed a look of interest. "What is that place?" "On the second-class street in the east of the city, there is a Leanly building. It sells the best wine, osmanthus wine. It has been overcrowded for only 2 days since it opened." The butler kept bragging for fear that the young man was dissatisfied, but I haven't found out the background behind it yet. I only know that a person named Mr. Yu went to the broker house to select people a few days ago. Now those people have become waiters of the Leanly building. The young man was more interested. "It is interesting that it can earn 7,000 taels in 2 days since it opened. I have never heard of Mr. Li. He is a secretive person and probably doesn't have great skills. You can go to receive the reward. Tomorrow, go to see the supervisor of the Leanly building. If they don't agree, do you know what to do?" The butler was overjoyed and immediately knelt and kowtowed. "Thank you, master. I know. The next day, Su Li came to the Qinghe girls' school in casual clothes. Today was the first day of school and it was very lively. "Lecturer Su is here." Lecturer Su." Lecturers passing by saw Su Li and greeted her very cordially. They all knew that Su Li not only became the special class lecturer of the Qinghe girls' school but also the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop in the Qinghe town. It could be said that she perfectly inherited the 2 identities of Gong Xiangjuan and became the person whose status was second only to satrap Yen in the Qinghe town. Su Li obtained such a high achievement at such a young age. The halo on her was so dazzling that it almost blinded others. Back to the courtyard of the school, Mammy Li had nothing to do. During this time, Xiaowu and Su Li lived here and cleaned every day. The floor in the room was so clean that it could almost reflect people's figures. Mammy Li quickly went to cook. Seeing that Su Li built a winery that was more profitable than the Baiwei building, she was completely at ease. Su Li looked at the back of Mammy Li and a ray of light flashed in her eyes. She wanted to ask why Mammy Li was so familiar with the Qinghe girls' school. But if she asked directly, Mammy Li might not answer. Although the relationship between them was tight enough, it did not include confessing the secrets that were difficult to say to each other in the past. "It seems that I have to find a way to test it." Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. She would never let the hidden danger stay by her side. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Su Li changed into the costume of Mr. Li and passed through the high walls of the School of Liberal Arts and the School of Martial Arts like a wisp of smoke. Then she came to the martial arts field. Looking at the empty arena, she picked up the bow on the table and pulled the bowstring under the dim moonlight. Her right eye squinted as she pulled the bowstring to the fullest. His fingers loosened. Clang! An arrow streaked across the night sky like a bolt of lightning, directly piercing through the bullseye and nailing itself firmly to the ground. The tail of the arrow was still trembling. Su Li changed to a stronger bow and took a deep breath. For the next part of the plan, it was time for her archery and swordsmanship to be practiced again. While Su Li was practicing her bow, Fang Yuan and others gathered together in the underground addendum of the Linli building and frowned. Did you find out? What is the background of the man who claimed to be the butler of the Jin family? Fang Yuan looked at Chu Qingning. Chu Qingning looked a little embarrassed and said, I went to the Tianya house and inquired about it. It is the Jin family in the Qinghe town. At least 5 people in the family are officials in the imperial court. Recently, the first master of the family has been looking for a restaurant to bribe. It is said that this is a task given by his father. If he succeeds, he will be the next successor of the Jin family. We've hit the muzzle of a gun. As soon as they heard the background of the Jin family, Yin Xuetong and Fang Mu changed their faces slightly. Even Fang Yuan frowned unconsciously and said, the Jin family has some background. Contact Su Li. We can't make the decision. Then, Fang Yuan immediately got up and walked out. He soon disappeared outside the door. Yin Xuetong asked curiously, isn't Su Li in the restaurant? Where else will she go except here? Chu Qingning scratched his head and said, she will go to the Qinghe girls' school. Go to school? There was a trace of envy in Yin Xuetong's eyes. She also wanted to go further in talent and learning, but she was not qualified now. At this time, Chu Qingning laughed and said, how can she go to school? She goes to class. Although she looks like a profiteer, she is the special class lecturer of the Qinghe girls' school. Besides, she is also the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop. Her status is comparable to that of the satrap. Yin Xuetong opened her mouth slightly in surprise. Her beautiful eyes were shining. Gradually, there was something called worship. Su Li was so powerful. Did she have such a high status? Chu Qingning said with a sneaky expression. He whispered, I told you secretly. Don't tell others. The relationship between Su Li and the winery has not been exposed. If Su Li knows that I told you, she will definitely skin me. Yin Xuetong nodded repeatedly and there was a little fear in her eyes. She was afraid that Chu Qingning would be skinned by Su Li. Fang Mu was speechless. Brother Chu's temperament didn't change at all. He was more daring than the sky. Aren't you afraid of being driven out of the Linli building if you talk about your master like this? Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. The sky gradually turned white. Su Li put down the bow and arrow and quickly destroyed the traces of her coming. When she returned to the courtyard, she suddenly noticed that there was someone in the room. But she soon relaxed. The pneuma was obviously Fang Yuan. Opening the door, Su Li sat down and poured herself a cup of tea. Fang Yuan flashed out from behind the bed. There was a rare trace of anger in his eyes. Where have you been? I have been waiting for you here all night. Su Li seemed to be startled by the voice. She turned around and saw Fang Yuan. Her eyes flashed with anger. She said, Fang Yuan, why are you hiding here instead of in the winery? Fang Yuan felt a little sorry in his heart, but it was soon covered by anger. He said, where have you been? Do you know that I am worried about you? The last sentence came from Fang Yuan's heart. Su Li looked at Fang Yuan and suddenly smiled. She said, don't forget that only the master can limit the freedom of the servant. You are working for me now. Do you want to limit my actions? Fang Yuan's eyes darkened. He completely calmed down and whispered, of course not. That's good. Su Li poured a cup of tea for Fang Yuan and didn't mean to explain her whereabouts. She said, tell me, why are you looking for me? Fang Yuan picked up the teacup, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Falling flowers yearn for love, heartless brook. He finally understood the meaning of this sentence. Then, Fang Yuan told Su Li what the Jin family found. Su Li was surprised. She had been waiting for the embroidery workshop to make trouble, but she didn't expect that the winery was the first one to make trouble. Jin family, all kinds of scenes appeared in Su Li's mind, and her eyes became darker. She took the special paper of the winery and quickly wrote a letter and gave it to Fang Yuan. Hand this letter to County Governor Manor. Fang Yuan took the letter, but Yan Zai's face appeared in his mind unconsciously. Should I look for him for help? But they had no friendship with Yan Zai, so why would he help them? Fang Yuan couldn't figure out Su Li's intention, but he still took the envelope and left. He had absolute confidence in Su Li's scheme. What was written in the letter was definitely not asking for help. The next day, the butler of the Jin family came again. Yin Xuetong refused with the excuse of asking for the master, but she was very uneasy. She always felt that the butler would take action soon. Although it was just intuition, Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning still arranged Haydn and others to guard around the Linli building, and they guarded one side respectively. It was dark and windy at night. The servants in the Linli building soon fell asleep. Fang Yuan was in the dark, holding a sword in his hand and leaning against the wall to sleep. Soon, a slight sound of breaking through the air sounded. He suddenly opened his eyes and rushed to the corner of the second floor like a civet. In the faint night light, Fang Yuan clearly saw a dozen black shadows quietly cut the door of the Linli building and then rushed in. Sure enough, they come. Fang Yuan smiled coldly and waved his right hand gently. Chu Qingning immediately understood and let people hiding in every corner of the building ignite the sleeping smoke. The sleeping smoke spread very fast. Before long, there was a sound of a dozen heavy objects falling in the building. Haydn and others who had already taken the antidote showed a wretched smile. They immediately extinguished the sleeping incense and dragged a dozen men in black into the underground adytum. They tied them up and locked them up. After opening the window to ventilate, the smell of sleeping incense dissipated. Chu Qingning shook his head and said, "The sleeping incense is really good. The Jin family is also a famous and distinguished family. How can they even do such dirty things?" Fang Yuan was expressionless and said coldly, "The more powerful a family is, the more dirty things it will do. You and I have met a lot of dirty things." Chu Qingning suddenly became speechless and sullen. Fang Yuan was like eating gunpowder in the past 2 days. He often choked people. Chu Qingning didn't know why he was angry. Forget it. As a married man, I don't care about him. Thinking that Yin Xuetong was still waiting for him in the room, Chu Qingning smiled. He didn't bother to interrogate the men in black and left in a hurry. Fang Yuan came to the underground adytum alone and lifted the masks of the men in black one by one. As expected, they were all servants of the Jin family. The intelligence system of the Tianya house was very terrifying. Even the means that the Jin family used to deal with the three families were clear. Because they got the news in advance, they could be prepared. Hierarch of the Inma cult, young master. Fang Yuan muttered to himself. His eyes were darker. He looked at the dozens of people who were tied up in the room, and his face showed a ruthless expression. For a day and a night, the dull screams were mixed with despair. However, the ground was full of guests and it was very lively. The butler of the Jin family waited in the room with a gloomy face. He felt more and more uneasy. The people he sent yesterday were like hitting a dog with a meat bun. None of them came back. It was really weird. Is there any force behind the Linli building? The butler looked at the portrait sent by a special person. There were only 2 faces in the portrait. One was Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning, and the other was a man in a bamboo hat without a face. The butler looked at it for a long time. The more he looked, the angrier he was. He almost tore the drawing. Damn it. Even the Tianya house didn't record these 2 faces. It was very likely that they were disguised faces. How could he investigate it? If it doesn't work, I can only let the master make the decision. Although the butler was extremely angry, he was not flustered. In his eyes, there was nothing that could baffle the master. After all, The master was the peerless genius who won the first place in the martial arts competition in the Qinghe province. Even satrap Yen said that the master would definitely become the mainstay of the Dahan country. How could such a master be baffled by a sneaky Mr. Li? It was a joke. On the other side, Yin Su forced himself to calm down. He took a letter to the satrap's mansion. Looking at the majestic and towering lintel, Yin Su had mixed feelings. He was slightly dull for a moment. As a foreign prisoner of war, he could enter the satrap's mansion one day. So, what are you doing? The guard of the satrap's mansion saw Yin Su's furtive behavior and immediately came up to ask. Yin Su looked serious. He didn't lose face for the Linli building. He said in a calm tone, I am from the Linli building. My master has a letter and wants the third child of the Yen family to read it in person. The Linli building? The guard's expression changed slightly. As a new force rising in the Qinghe town, the name of the winery had been known by many people in the Qinghe town. Naturally, they had heard of it. And it was said that the third child of the Yen family had met the boss of the Linli building once. Thinking of this, the guard relaxed and said, Wait a moment. I will go in and report. Chapter 94. A letter from Mr. Li? In the study, Yen Zai received the notice and felt confused. He couldn't help but think of the mysterious woman who was calm all the time in the prisoner camp. Let him come in. Yen Zai waved his hand. He didn't have a close relationship with Mr. Li. The letter came suddenly. He also wanted to know what the woman was going to do. After a while, Yin Su walked into the study and saw Yen Zai. He couldn't help but be shocked. Wasn't this the lieutenant general that he met in the prisoner camp that day? Yen Zai only felt that the person was familiar. After thinking for a while, he remembered that he was one of the prisoners that Mr. Li brought back. He didn't expect that after half a month, the spirit of this person was completely different. He didn't have the breath of a prisoner camp. Mr. Li's means of training people are really superb. Yen Zai couldn't help but praise. Yin Su was annoyed and couldn't help but refute. Master, you are wrong. We didn't receive any training in the Linli building. Everything is voluntary. As Mr. Li taught us, if we want to change our fate, we can only rely on ourselves. Mr. Li just gave us a chance. Before he finished his words, the maid standing beside Yen Zai immediately scolded him. How dare you? You are just a servant who delivers a letter. How can you speak here? Kneel down and apologize for your mistake. Yin Su's eyelids trembled. There was a little fear in his eyes, but he didn't kneel down. Instead, he looked at the maid who scolded him angrily. He didn't avoid her eyes and even looked stubborn. The maid was immediately annoyed. When she was about to call someone, Yen Zai waved his hand and said with a smile, Ling, you can leave. Master. The maid felt wronged and couldn't help but stamp her feet. But in the end, she didn't dare to disobey Yen Zai and left with hatred. Yin Su also felt bad. If Yen Zai didn't speak, he was likely to be driven out by the Yen family and even beaten. But even if he knew the result, he didn't want to lose his self-esteem. Yen Zai looked at Yin Su with appreciation. Although in his opinion, Yin Su's impulse was worthless, not everyone had such courage. There were only 2 people left in the room. Yin Su remembered the business and quickly put the unwrinkled envelope gently on the table. Yen Zai took it and opened it. There was only a thin piece of letter paper with only 1 line of words in it. Child Yen, the Linli building still remembers the help of the prisoner camp. Can you come to the Linli building tomorrow night and drink osmanthus wine with me? It was just an invitation. Yen Zai was puzzled and felt that Mr. Li was more unpredictable. However, he had nothing to do now. The Linli building was not a dangerous place. It was better to go and have a look. Thinking of this, Yen Zai nodded slightly and said with a smile, Your name is Yin Su, right? Linlin said, Child. Yen nodded and said. Receiving a reply, Yin Su's face lit up with joy. He quickly lowered his body and nodded, My master will be waiting for you tomorrow. Seeing Yin Su leave, Yen Zai was a little envious. The new servant of Mr. Li could be so clever. Why didn't he have any talented people around him? Yen suddenly, T, Su, T Yen. Yen For 2 days in a row, the Linli building was peaceful and there was no accident. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning both sensed something unusual. The Jin family was in the dark, and they were in the light. The situation was not good for them. When Su Li got the news, her eyes flashed and she didn't say anything. Fang Yuan didn't ask more consciously. That night, Yan Zai came to the Linli building alone in casual clothes. He was immediately welcomed to the top floor. The Linli building was like a tower. There was only one room on the top floor. It was spacious, but the layout was much more chic and elegant than that downstairs. Yan Zai stood outside the door and looked at Su Li, who stood by the window with her back to him. He couldn't help but say with a smile, "Mr. Li is really in a good mood. It must be a special feeling to appreciate the moon on the top floor. But the Lantern Festival has passed. Today's moon is new." Su Li turned around. She didn't wear a bamboo hat, but a veil. Her black hair was in a bun with a green hairpin. It complemented the simple decoration in the room. She was extremely fresh. "Child Yen, you are really punctual." After praising him, Su Li chuckled under the veil. She walked lightly and sat opposite to Yan Zai. Then she poured a cup of osmanthus wine for him. Yan Zai smiled slightly and took a sip. His eyes suddenly brightened. He sighed and said, "I have practiced martial arts since I was a child. I am not a greedy person. I have drunk a lot of wine, but none of them is as gentle as the wine brewed by Mr. Li. It is like a beautiful woman in the water town of the south of the Yangtze River." "Child, you must be joking. Speaking of wine, you are much better than those who claim to be immortals in wine." Su Li smiled lightly and said, "However, Child Yen doesn't hesitate at all. Aren't you afraid that I will poison the wine?" Yan Zai's smile froze. He slowly put down the wine cup in his hand, but he didn't panic. Instead, he said calmly, "What do you mean? Is it possible that someone dares to poison me in the Qinghe town?" Su Li picked up the flagon and poured herself a cup. Her tone gradually became ethereal. "Child, you are wrong again. Whether you dare or not is different from whether you are willing or not. At least for me, if I want you to die, I can do it without any trace. Even if Satrap Yen knows it, he can do nothing about it." Yan Zai's left hand hidden under the table trembled slightly. He looked more and more uneasy. It seemed that a cold breath rose from the soles of his feet and went straight to the top of his head. Mr. Li was not a good person. He felt a little regret in his heart. One could know a person's face but not his heart. Moreover, he didn't even see Mr. Li's true face. If he knew it, he wouldn't be so arrogant and come alone. At this time, Su Li chuckled and said, "However, Child Yen, don't worry. Since I invited you to taste wine, I will not harm you." Not only would he not harm you, he would even protect you. With young master's intelligence and wisdom, you should be able to figure this out, right? Yan Zai was suddenly enlightened when Su Li pointed out the stakes. Yes, the Linli building invited him above board. If they really poisoned him, the Linli building would be destroyed early. It would only bring disaster to the Linli building early. For the sake of the Linli building, Mr. Li naturally wanted to protect him. After figuring it out, Yan Zai didn't feel relaxed. Instead, there was a layer of cold sweat on his forehead. The rhythm of the conversation was completely controlled by the mysterious woman. His thoughts were simply swayed by her. It was not his turn to make decisions. Su Li shook the clear wine in her hand and said lightly, "Child Yen, don't be nervous. Today, I invite you to taste wine. Of course, there are other things. Child, please look down the stairs." Hearing that Su Li talked about business, Yan Zai immediately felt relaxed. He stood up and held the stairs to look down to the first floor. He saw a middle-aged man in a black silk robe sitting downstairs with an arrogant face. But it was too noisy in the building, so he couldn't hear what he was talking about. Isn't he the butler of the Jin family? Yan Zai recognized the middle-aged man at a glance. He was surprised and immediately remembered the latest information given to him in the mansion. He suddenly understood. It turned out that the Linli building was targeted by the Jin family. Mr. Li looked for him because he had something to ask. Yan Zai made up his mind and immediately became calm. It seemed that he took the initiative. He turned around and said bitterly, the Jin family repeatedly destroyed the industry of the Qinghe town. It's really hateful. But the Jin family has a deep background. Even my father may not be able to stop them from plotting against Mr. Li's winery. Mr. Li, I'm afraid that you are asking the wrong person this time. When he said this, Yan Zai raised his head, only to be met with a pair of pitch-black eyes that seemed to be smiling yet not smiling. There was a faint trace of mockery in them. The deep darkness was like a boundless hell, causing one to involuntarily sink into it. Yan Zai's heart thumped and he couldn't help but step back. It seemed that things were not as he thought. Child, are you kidding? Su Li put down the wine cup and leaned lazily on the back of the chair. She said, When did I say that? Do I ask you to help me this time? No. Yan Zai was confused. Then why did she ask him to look at the first floor? The Linli building is a place for business. I ask you to come here because I have a deal to talk about. Su Li's eyes became soft like a peerless enchantress. She said, Are you interested? Yan Zai frowned and sat down again. What's there to talk about between you and me? Mr. Li didn't have what he wanted. He couldn't do what Mr. Li asked. Yan Zai felt that Su Li's deal had failed before she said it. But Su Li looked confident and said, Of course, there are many things. For example, your sister always wants to be a general and your dream in your heart. If you don't mind, I can help you realize it. But what you have to pay is actually very little. Hearing this, Yan Zai's face finally changed dramatically and his expression was full of horror. Who on earth was Mr. Li? How did he know about his family matters and even guess what he was thinking? It was impossible. Yan Zai didn't believe it at all. Su Li gently took a sip of the sweet wine, and there was a vague recollection in her eyes. In the previous life, someone wrote a biography for Yan Hongxiu, but it was not a glorious history. She was remembered as the wife of Jin Qing Ao, the first child of the Jin family. Her tragic life was blocked by the Jin family, but the biography circulating in the martial arts circle couldn't be blocked by the Jin family. Su Li had read it carefully in the previous life. After all, she was also from the Qinghe province. Naturally, she was interested in the people in the Qinghe province. The person who wrote the biography obviously knew Yan Hongxiu very well. It described in detail the agreement between Yan Hongxiu and her father at home when she was a child. The third brother, who had the closest relationship with her, was also mentioned repeatedly. The most mentioned was that Yan Zai yearned for freedom and was extremely eager to be a free chivalrous man in the martial arts circle. But it was almost impossible for Yan Zai, who was from an official family, to realize his dream. Child's dream is a taboo. Your origin is destined to make what you want become an extravagant hope. But it is not difficult for me to solve it. Su Li said obscurely, but Yan Zai understood. He suddenly fell into a deep silence. After a long time, he smiled bitterly and said, Don't joke, Mr. Li. The trajectory of my life has been fixed. There is no need to struggle. At this moment, Yan Zai completely removed his disguise and all his thoughts were written on his face. He had no secrets in front of Su Li. Oh? Su Li tilted her head and supported half of her cheek with her right hand. She said softly, I said, it is not difficult. If you don't believe it, you can let your sister have a try. The agreement between the fourth sister and my father? Yan Zai took a deep breath and shook his head. That is even more impossible. To be honest, even my father can't pull the bow that my father gave to my sister. My father is not only the satrap but also the first senior in the Qinghe town. It is said that only the legendary... Chapter 95. In front of Yan Zai, there was a cup of wine standing in the air, as if it was held by an invisible hand. Such a strange scene made Yan Zai's mouth dry. He hesitated to say the first half of the sentence. Only the inborn senior can pull it away? Su Li chuckled and then opened her palm. The wine cup hanging in the air was immediately pulled back to Su Li's hand. As for the legendary Xiantian stage, the most obvious sign is telekinesis. Child Yan, am I right? Su Li's low and magnetic voice rang in his ears. Yan Zai felt cold all over. He looked straight ahead and couldn't make any expression on his face. This woman, who seemed to be in her 20s, turned out to be an inborn senior. The legendary inborn senior who could fight against tens of thousands of troops by himself. His mind exploded and turned blank. From childhood he constantly heard rumors about the inborn senior. He didn't expect that he would meet one so easily today. And he even wanted to make trouble for her before? Yen Zai's heart was in turmoil. Countless thoughts came to his mind in an instant. The Jin family even wanted to make trouble for the inborn senior? It was as if the god of longevity had hung himself. He was tired of living. I always don't like killing. So, even if the Jin family makes things difficult for me and even secretly sends warriors here, I just accept all the orders and don't fight back. But it doesn't mean that I'm not angry. Do you know third child Yen? Su Li's words were no longer soft. With the momentum of the inborn realm, it was full of pressure. Yen Zai's back was instantly wet. He immediately nodded to show that he understood. That's good. However, considering the current situation of the Yen family, it's too much to ask you to deal with the Jin family. I'm not an unreasonable person. So, I will make a deal with your sister. Can you promise me? Yen Zai was happy and blurted out, "It's an honor for my sister to be Mr. Li's apprentice." What's the deal? I'd like to hear the details. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly and moved her lips. Yen Zai nodded again and again. An hour later, Yen Zai left from the back door of the Lin Li building. Before he could take a breath, he hurried back to the mansion and found his sister who was still practicing the bow in the martial arts field. Hong Xiu. Yen Hongxiu heard the familiar voice and immediately turned back in surprise. She shouted happily, "Third brother, where have you been? I haven't seen you all night." Yen Hongxiu said and walked closer. Then she saw that Yen Zai was sweating as if he was fished out of the water. She suddenly froze. It seemed that she hadn't seen her third brother in such a mess for a long time. Yen Zai looked around and saw that no one was around. He immediately whispered, "Hong Xiu, what I'm going to say next is a secret. You must not reveal this to anyone, including father, mother, and Huan. I found you a master who can teach you archery." After that, Yen Zai left in a hurry, leaving Yen Hongxiu, who was confused, muttering to herself, "What master? Aren't there many masters who practice archery at home? Third brother is acting strange today." After Yen Zai left the Lin Li building, there was chaos in the hall on the first floor. Go back and tell Jin Qing'o. Don't think that you can do whatever you want just because someone in your family is an official in the imperial court. Our Jin family doesn't buy it. Yin Xuetong looked angry. Her delicate rebuke made the entire winery quiet, and all the guests who were drinking were stunned. Kim family? Which Kim family? Is there any Kim family in the Qinghe town? Of course, it's that Kim family. Some people couldn't help but whisper. Tut, the Kim family is really unscrupulous. They want to take advantage of everything. Do they really think that they are the local tyrants in the Qinghe town? Hush. Be quiet. Don't talk nonsense. Be careful of your life. However, the Lin Li building is targeted by the Kim family. I'm afraid that it will be dangerous. This winery seems to have no background. Hearing the discussions around him, Butler Jin's face was livid. Since he became the chief butler of the Jin family, he had never been so humiliated. It was a great shame. How dare the Lin Li building offend them? Butler Jin pointed at Yin Xuetong, who was about to cry. It seemed that it was a trick of a bully to bully a weak girl. Many drinkers couldn't stand it. Immediately, a tall and strong man stood up and said in a rough voice, "Old bastard, what are you doing? Get out of here. If you don't care, I'll beat you to death." Someone took the lead, and immediately a group of people who were drunk stood up and jeered, "Yes. I don't like your Jin family for a long time. Get out of here." "Don't get out. Beat them to death." Lao Li, whose face was red, picked up the stool and threw it at them. Crack. Butler Jin dodged awkwardly. The stool fell to the ground and made a crisp sound. But it was like a fuse, which aroused the ferocity of the drunkards. "Go up and beat them." "Go up. Those who are afraid of death are idiots." The scene suddenly became chaotic. The tables and chairs were mixed with drinks and pastries. Yin Xuetong didn't expect that the effect was so good. She quickly took people to hide in the back hall and let the people in the front hall fight. Hearing the screams coming from outside from time to time, Yin Xuetong couldn't help but smile. There was a saying that the law couldn't punish the masses. Butler Jean was beaten for nothing today, but the Jean family would definitely blame it on them. What should they do? I learned another trick from Su Li. It's so cool. Chu Qingning smiled and rubbed Yin Xuetong's soft hair. He said, "Don't think about it. Since Su Li asked us to do this, she must have other tricks. Let's do it." Yin Xuetong answered softly. Then she hesitated and whispered, "Su Li is so powerful and beautiful. Will you?" Chu Qingning was stunned and immediately showed an extremely frightened expression. He rubbed Yin Xuetong's chubby face and scolded her with a smile. "Little girl, what are you thinking about? Su Li is such a tigress. I can't afford to provoke her. Only Fang Yuan, the masochist." Yin Xuetong held back her laughter and pointed behind Chu Qingning. Chu Qingning seemed to feel something and couldn't help but look back. Suddenly he saw Su Li and Fang Yuan standing by the door. He didn't know how long they had been listening. Chu Qingning was immediately scared to death. "Xueng, you are also bad. You even hurt me." With the screams of Chu Qingning and Butler Jean, there was a burst of laughter in the back hall. After the chaos, Butler Jean was beaten black and blue and fled awkwardly. The drinkers gradually sobered up and immediately realized what a stupid thing they had done. They slipped away at the same time. Before leaving, they did not forget to leave money for the drinks. Yin Su and the others felt great when they saw this. They had long disliked Butler Jean. They had thought that the Linli building would definitely be humble or compromise with the Jean family. They were still worried about their situation. They did not expect that the attitude of the superior was so resolute. "I hope Mr. Li and others can make it." Yin Su and others prayed secretly. When the winery was in trouble, their cohesion immediately improved significantly. On the top floor, Su Li stood on the edge of the stairs. Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan, who were beaten into a panda's face, stood behind her. They were all speechless. "What are you going to do next?" Fang Yuan couldn't help but ask. In this way, they undoubtedly offended the Jean family. As the saying goes, people don't fight with officials. They violated the taboo. Next, they would face a storm of attacks. Maybe the winery would be closed tomorrow. "Even if we don't do it, the winery will be closed tomorrow," Su Li said in a heavy tone. "Jean Qing Ao's patience is limited. He won't do it more than 3 times. If we don't agree today, their means will be endless. So, we have a lot to do tonight." Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning frowned at the same time. From her tone, why did they feel that Su Li knew Jean Qing Ao very well? Before everyone had a rest, Su Li and others told Haydn to be on guard. Then they changed into night clothes and went out of the city. Chu Qingning saw that Su Li used her martial arts movement and her speed was no less than theirs. He was so shocked that he widened his eyes. It turned out that Su Li knew martial arts. And it seemed that her realm was not low. She had been hiding it. When Chu Qingning thought of everything in the past 6 months, he felt angry. In the end, Su Li had been guarding against them all the time. Fang Yuan's reaction was much calmer than that of Chu Qingning. As early as when Su Li healed Fang Mu, he had some doubts. Now it just confirmed the speculation in his heart. Thinking of those gangsters he killed in the South Street of the Desu town a long time ago, Su Li was accustomed to the bloody scene. Fang Yuan was slightly nervous. Did she kill people? How many did she kill? Su Li flew against the night wind, but she didn't mean to explain. The new moon was gradually wrapped in heavy clouds, and the scenery under the whole night sky became dreamy. "Su Li, where are we going? We have been out of the city for an hour." Chu Qingning whispered impatiently. He hadn't reached the acquired 8th hurdle, so he hadn't mastered the ability to condense sounds into lines. Su Li's lips moved, and her clear voice came into the ears of Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan. "Chu Qingning, from now on, you can't speak. Listen to my order. Fang Yuan, communicate with me in sound transmission. Don't leave any evidence." Then, Su Li handed 2 bone-changing pills to them. These 2 pills were her new attempt. The effect of camouflage was stronger, but the relative duration was much shorter. So, she didn't give them to them until now. Chu Qingning took a breath and felt that his heart, liver, spleen, lungs and kidneys were all hurt. Originally, Fang Yuan's cultivation was higher than his, and he could comfort himself that Su Li didn't know martial arts. But now Su Li's real cultivation was also after the acquired 8th hurdle. How could he live? In the past, I could be the first genius of the family. But since I met Su Li, my cultivation talent is actually low. For a moment, Chu Qingning's eyes were slightly moist, and he felt wronged. Fang Yuan's eyes flashed. He was still thinking about what the green starlight was. He guessed Su Li's cultivation realm, so he was not surprised. Is that where we are going? At this time, Su Li stopped and pointed to a mountain. Under the dim starlight, they could vaguely see a small camp on the top of the mountain. The fire was like fireflies. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning's faces changed slightly. What are we going to do there? Chapter 96. At this moment in the village, Butler Jean covered his face with a towel and shouted angrily, "I don't care. Don't forget that you are just a dog of the Jean family. The first master is the future head of the Jean family and even the general of the Dahan country. How dare you disobey his orders?" As soon as he said that, the 3 leaders of the tiger village looked gloomy. Although what Butler Jean said was true, his words were too explicit and ugly. He didn't give them any face. At this time, the burly first leader stood up and said in a low voice, "Butler Jean, since you said so, we have no reason to refuse. We, the Raging Tiger Troop, have no reason to refuse, but you have to give us time to prepare. Otherwise, we will be surrounded by the government, and your Jean family will be in trouble." Butler Jean snorted and suppressed his anger. He shouted coldly, "Tomorrow at the latest. Tomorrow, I will see you catch all the people of the Leanly building and let the child punish them. Especially their boss, Mr. Li. Even if you can't catch others, you must catch this person." Then Butler Jean took out the portrait from his arms. The first leader took it and looked at it. He was so angry that he laughed and said, "Butler, you are making things difficult for us. A person with a bamboo hat is everywhere on the street. Where can we find him? Even if we really bring him back, you won't recognize him." Butler Jean wanted to continue to say something. Suddenly, he stared at the back of the first leader. The 2 leaders subconsciously looked back and saw a sword and a saber quickly enlarged in front of them. The sword almost pierced their hearts at the same time. Ho ho, warm blood spurted out. The 2 people made an inexplicable sound. Soon they fell to the ground, twitched and died. Seeing this scene, Butler Jin's blood was almost frozen. He was so scared that he couldn't move. He was afraid that if he moved, he would be the same as the 2 leaders of the tiger village. When the first leader heard the sound, his pupils shrank. He rushed out of the window like lightning. He thought that it was not a problem for him to escape with his cultivation and body movement. But soon he found that his body strangely stopped. No matter how he ran forward. Then, what made him even more scared was that his body began to involuntarily step back. It was as if time went back and he returned to the original place. Ghost! Butler Jean was so scared that he fainted. The great leader was left alone, immersed in fear and unable to move. Telekinesis. It was telekinesis. Motherfucker, when did I offend a legendary figure? At this moment, the faint sound of wind blew over, and the great leader immediately smelled an extremely thick stench of blood. Apart from the living people in the houses, the entire Raging Tiger Bastion was dead silent. Not a single sound could be heard. Hoo-hoo, the great leader couldn't help but gasp in fear. Slowly turning around, he saw the bamboo hat man. His eyes widened as he looked at the portrait in his hand. He immediately understood what had happened. Butler Jean, you're courting death. How dare you bring the Raging Tiger Troop with you? Tick-tock, tick-tock. Blood flowed down the tip of the sword and knife, dripping onto the dust with a dull sound. Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan stared at Su Li in a daze. Their faces were dull, but their hearts were in turmoil. Even though they had overestimated Su Li's cultivation and even thought that she was a senior at the peak of the acquired realm, they didn't expect that she was also a young master of the inborn realm. Another young master of the inborn realm. When did the young master of the inborn realm become so worthless? Chu Qingning curled his lips and looked at Fang Yuan, who was in a daze. He inexplicably felt distressed for him. Fang Yuan thought that others couldn't see it, but he was experienced after all. How could he not understand Fang Yuan's thoughts? Unfortunately, Fang Yuan was excellent, but it seemed that he was still far from being worthy of Su Li. Fang Yuan's eyes were firm. He tightly grasped the hilt of the sword, and the blood on his hands fell faster. He would not admit defeat. I admit defeat, and you can punish me as you wish. The great leader was very relaxed. Since Su Li was not in a hurry to kill him, it was obvious that she had something to ask, and he had a chance to live. Su Li chuckled and said, "If you hadn't promised Butler Jean before, I might have felt guilty in my heart." The implication was that even if he didn't promise, this horrible woman would kill all the people in the raging tiger village. The great leader's lips trembled slightly. Compared with the real evil figures, what he had done before seemed to be child's play and was not worth mentioning at all. Those who kill will be killed by others. The people I killed in this life deserve it, and I won't have any guilt in my heart. Su Li suddenly muttered to herself, and then she sighed charmingly, "Wu Lin, you have committed countless sins in your life. You deserve to die, but I will let you choose a more dignified way to die. What do you think? How do you know my name?" The great leader's face was completely pale, as if the name was a taboo for him. "I not only know it, but also know that you have a wife, a son, and an old mother. In your family, you are a businessman who doesn't know how to do business. You are not a bandit who commits all kinds of crimes, such as burning, killing, and looting." Su Li's words were light, but it made the 8-foot-tall man tremble all over. He knelt down and cried, "Senior, I will do as you say. Please don't tell the truth to my family." Seeing Wu Lin kneeling at the feet of Su Li, Chu Qingning and Fang Yuan were completely silent, and it was difficult for them to calm down. It seemed that they knew Su Li for the first time today. The girl who seemed to be only 16 years old seemed to be more complicated than they thought. Late at night, the cold wind blew. The three people walked on the mountain road, and they were all protected by the genuine energy, so they were not cold. Facing the cold moonlight, Su Li held a small box in her hand and suddenly smiled. "What? Do you think I am despicable and cruel?" Chu Qingning immediately shook his head, and then he was silent for a moment and said, "The weak are pitiful and hateful. Wu Lin is not weak, so there is only hatred left. But if he dies, his family, I will take care of him secretly." Fang Yuan said, and obviously he couldn't bear to die. "Very good." Su Li smiled with melancholy. "You still have compassion as a human, but I accidentally lost it a long time ago." In the night, there was a sweet chuckle, but it was sad in people's ears. The next day, the Qinghe provincial office really received Wu Lin's surrender, and an account was presented, which recorded the absurd things that the Jin family asked him to do secretly in these years. Satrap Yen was furious, but he didn't take any action. Obviously, the troops under his command were mobilized frequently. Su Li knew that it was impossible to bring down the Jin family only by this point. Wu Lin would finally die in prison, and the ending had been written, because he took the poison prepared by herself. Jin Qing, Ao, in the previous life, you took people to beat him to death on the street and ruin my family. In this life, I'll let you have a taste of how painful that feeling is. Su Li stood on the top floor and looked at the south of the city. There seemed to be 2 clusters of small flames burning in her dark pupils. The matter of the tiger village was exposed, and the Jin family was badly battered. They had no time to pay attention to the Linli building. Su Li was free but not free. There were too many things to prepare. Butler Jean returned to the Jin family in a daze, and he couldn't remember what happened last night. Didn't he go to the tiger village to give the order of the master? Why did he come back in a daze? Unconsciously, Butler Jean came to the study of Jin Qing Ao. Jean Ching Ao looked gloomy. When he saw Butler Jean coming, he slapped him without saying a word. Slap. Butler Jean couldn't stand the slap. He was thrown to the wall directly. He saw stars and spat out several teeth. Idiot! What did you do yesterday? Jean Ching Ao was full of anger. Because of the matter of the tiger village, he was scolded by his father. Even the official's visit was blamed on him. He never allowed any stain on himself. When did he suffer such grievances? And all of this was brought by Butler Jean? Butler Jean was stunned. When he heard the angry words of the master, he immediately got up and knelt down. He repeatedly begged for mercy. Master, please understand. Yesterday, I went to the tiger village according to your order. He didn't dare to say that he seemed to remember nothing. He could only find something to say according to the original memory. Unexpectedly, when he just opened his mouth, he was slapped again. How dare you say that? Do you really think that I don't dare to change the butler? Don't hit me. I know I'm wrong. Master, someone will die if you hit me again. Butler Jean was almost beaten to death, but he couldn't say anything about what happened last night. Jean Ching Ao suddenly felt that he must have something to hide. One of Butler Jin's legs was broken. His ending was miserable. Jean Ching Ao asked someone to carry Butler Jean who couldn't speak. He restrained his anger and sneered, no matter who did it, it's ridiculous to rely on the tiger village to bring down the Jean family. The so-called account and confession were all Wu Lin's words. As long as the Jean family didn't admit it, they would be safe. But on the third day, the Jean family suddenly learned from the informant of the official that Wu Lin suddenly died in prison. Before he died, he wrote the name Jean Ching Ao. It made Jean Ching Ao feel cold. He finally realized that the opponent's means were not as simple as he thought. In the satrap's mansion, Yen Zai said angrily, "Father, the Jean family is too much. They don't respect the satrap's mansion at all. They even dare to kill people in prison. They are lawless." In front of him stood an elegant middle-aged man in an official uniform. From the surface, no one could see that he was Yen Shishuan, the satrap who was in charge of the military power in the Qinghe town. Instead, he was more like a Confucian scholar who was well-read. At this moment, the Confucian scholar's face was very cold. Obviously, he was extremely angry. The Jean family killed people in the government, which really challenged his bottom line. If he didn't do something, people would really think that he was just a decoration. But in his opinion, this matter was strange everywhere. He couldn't say it out. It was all based on his intuition. Although the Jean family was arrogant, they were arrogant secretly. He couldn't get anything on them. But this time, it was too obvious. Thinking of this, he raised his hand and asked, "Zai, you took people to investigate the tiger village. What's the result?" Yen Zai's expression didn't change. He nodded resolutely and said, "As Wu Lin said, the tiger village was destroyed by the enemy. No one survived. It seems that Wu Lin surrendered himself to the government in order to save his life. But he failed to escape from the evil hands of the Jean family. It's really sad." Yen Shishuan snorted coldly and said, "Wu Lin is guilty and deserves to die. Even if his stronghold was exterminated, there's nothing to be pitied about. Those people all killed people. Zai, it's not the right place for you to be compassionate. You still need to gain more experience." "Yes, father." Yen Zai responded obediently. He retreated and went back to his house. But he found that his back was wet. In addition to the Linli building, only he knew that the tiger village was controlled by Ms. Li. His father also used to be a person in the martial arts circle. Sure enough, people in the martial arts circle were all so cold-hearted and ruthless. For a moment, Yen Zai was confused. He didn't know whether he was working hard in the right direction. Rumors gradually spread in the city. It turned out that the Jean family secretly supported the bandits. In these years, they burned, killed, and looted. No one knew how much dirty money they had seized, but they pretended to be sanctimonious all day long. Among the ordinary people, there was public indignation, but they didn't dare to say anything. It was Su Li who arranged people to spread such remarks. Chu Qingning had been paying attention to the progress of things. When the discussion calmed down, he immediately came to Su Li to ask for the next step. The next step? Su Li put on her cloak and shrugged as if nothing had happened. She said, "I'm going to class. I have classes tomorrow." Chu Qingning was stunned and instantly speechless. Su Li's words seemed that she and Fang Yuan were the ones who caused all the troubles in the Qinghe town. Chapter 97. The cold wind was whistling outside, and the stove was lit in the warm room. It was as warm as spring. Yan Hongxiu pushed the door open and rushed in with her maid Huan. Her body, which was slightly curled up in the cold, suddenly stretched out. She glanced at Su Li, who was already sitting at the desk. She snorted and sat in her seat. Other seats were empty. Yan Hongxiu was the first to arrive. After a while, the other 4 people also came to the warm room. Jean Ruolin was still the last one, but she arrived on time. As soon as Jean Ruolin appeared, others immediately looked at her. Yan Hongxiu's eyes were cold. There were too many rumors about the Jean family these days. She didn't expect that Jean Ruolin dared to come to class at such a sensitive time. Jean Ruolin felt bitter in her heart. She didn't want to come at all. But thinking of Su Li's means last time, how dare she not come? Even if her family ordered her not to go out at will, she still sneaked out from the back door to attend class. Since everyone is here, let's start the class. Su Li, who was sitting at the desk and taking a nap, opened her eyes and said lightly, "Today Su Li was very familiar with the details of Han embroidery. Gong Min and others were fascinated by it. But Yan Hongxiu, who had never been interested in embroidery, began to be absent-minded. Su Li probably doesn't know how chaotic the outside world is. Su Li is born in an ordinary family, but she lives in the school with a skill. She is also happy." Yan Hongxiu thought with a trace of helplessness. Since the old guy of the Jean family became a supervisor, the situation of the family is getting worse year by year. If only I could share the burden for my father. The third brother said that the archery master he found for me is coming. I have never seen such an arrogant master. I haven't seen him for several days. Tonight, I want to see whether the master has 3 heads and 6 arms or is an almighty immortal. Even the third brother admires him so much. Suddenly, Su Li's harsh voice sounded in her ears. "Yan Hongxiu, what did I just say? Repeat it." Yan Hongxiu was scared and finally came to herself. Seeing Su Li, Gong Min and others looking at her expressionlessly, she blushed. "I stand aside and listen to the class. If you dare to be absent-minded next time, go out." Su Li's tone was light. Yan Hongxiu looked at the ice and snow outside and couldn't help but shiver slightly. She didn't dare to be distracted anymore. After class, Su Li assigned the embroidery homework and turned to leave. Seeing that Su Li walked out of the door, Yan Hongxiu finally couldn't help but sit down directly. She rubbed her sore legs and tears welled up in her eyes. She said, Su Li, how dare you treat me like this? Miss, are you all right?" Huan ran over to help Yan Hongxiu up. She couldn't help but wave her fist and said angrily, "Su Li is too much. Miss, why don't we find someone to beat them up?" Yan Hongxiu burst into laughter. She couldn't help but touch Huan Er's nose. "This can't work. I will be a female general in the future. A general should be fair. This time I was absent-minded in class, so I should be punished a little. How can I trouble Su Li?" Huan looked at Yan Hongxiu in horror, as if she didn't know the person in front of her. If it was in the past, the young lady would definitely not have said that. How could the young lady's temper become so good after a few days of class? After class, Su Li stayed in the school for half a day. She didn't return to the courtyard until the evening. After dinner, she changed into the identity of Mr. Li and walked slowly to the martial arts field of the girls' school. At this moment, Yan Hongxiu wore a thin martial arts suit and stood shivering in the cold wind. She looked at Yan Zai with hidden bitterness. She was so cold that she couldn't speak clearly. "Brother, will the master you speak of really come? It's almost midnight. Do you want to freeze Xiu to death?" Yan Zai's face was also pale with cold. He didn't dare to say that he and Mr. Li had an appointment at midnight. Because he couldn't restrain his respect for the inborn senior, He came a little earlier. Suddenly, Yen Hongxiu saw a figure flashed behind Yen Zai, and there was a man in white. She was so scared that she almost screamed. Fortunately, Yen Zai covered her mouth in time, so she didn't disturb the people of the school. Third child, is this your sister, Yen Hongxiu? She really is a beauty in the making. Mr. Li's voice sounded in Yen Zai's ears. It was still so strange that people couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. Yen Zai had heard this voice for a long time, but he felt that the voice was inexplicably pleasant. Maybe the extraordinariness of the inborn senior had been deified in his heart. Yen Hongxiu looked strange. She finally confirmed that the man in the bamboo hat, who was neither a man nor a woman, was the archery master that the third brother found for her. She couldn't help but point at Su Li and said angrily, "Third brother, who is he? He is so sneaky. I can tell that he is not a good person. What kind of master did you find for me?" Yen Zai was so scared that he broke into a cold sweat. He couldn't help but scold, "Shut up. Be respectful to the master." Yen Hongxiu had never seen such a fierce third brother. Her eyes suddenly turned red and she said, "Third brother, why are you so fierce to me?" After the stress, Yen Zai realized what he had done. He scolded himself for being stupid in his heart, but he didn't know how to comfort and explain. At this time, Su Li chuckled and said, "Forget it. Third child Yen, you are innocent because you didn't know. Your sister did it unintentionally. Don't be angry. It's me who was rude." Yen Zai was ashamed and thought that the temperament of the inborn senior was really beyond the reach of ordinary people. Yen Hongxiu was strong and didn't cry. She took the bow off her back and handed it to Su Li with difficulty. She said, "Since you are the archery master that the third brother found, show me some real skills. Otherwise, no matter who you are not qualified for me to call you master." Fourth sister. Yen Zai's words turned into a sigh at last. Even if he said that Mr. Li was an inborn senior, the fourth sister wouldn't think that it was powerful. The womenfolk of the Yen family knew far less about the martial arts circle than the men. "Is this the bow that your father gave you?" Su Li took it with one hand and looked at it carefully. There seemed to be a flash of light in her eyes. She sighed softly and said, "It is really a spiritual bow. He is even willing to give a spiritual bow to his daughter. It seems that satrap Yen dotes on Miss Hongxiu very much." Yen Hongxiu's face was slightly red. She turned her head and snorted. She thought that even if he praised her, she wouldn't be happy at all. Yen Zai sighed. His father was really forcing her. If Yen Hongxiu couldn't break through to the inborn realm, she couldn't draw the bow in her life, let alone 3 years. This year was the last year. After this year, the fourth sister could only stay at home and wait for her marriage. "I absolutely wouldn't allow my sister to become a victim of the family." Yen Zai's eyes flashed fiercely. He made a fist and palm salute to Su Li. He bowed deeply and said, "Mr. Li, my sister is yours. She only has 1 year. Although the request is too much, I still want to say that if my sister can't fulfill the agreement with my father, please help us." "Brother, what are you doing?" Yen Hongxiu saw that he was so humble. She was angry and said angrily, "Isn't it just a broken bow? Give me another year and I will definitely draw it." Yen Zai shook his head and still looked at Su Li without blinking. Su Li's bamboo hat moved a little. It seemed that she was considering the feasibility of the matter. After a while, she shook her head and said, "Third child Yen, you don't have to do this." Yen Zai's body collapsed and he couldn't help showing disappointment on his face. As expected, she didn't agree. Well, the martial arts circle and the imperial court had always complemented each other. His request was too much. "Although the Linli building is not a big winery, we can still guarantee our credibility. Since we have made an agreement with you, we can certainly do it. If we can't do it, there is only one possibility. That is, the Linli building doesn't exist. Are you satisfied?" Yen Zai was stunned on the spot. Did Ms. Li know what she was talking about? Why did it sound like an unrealistic lie to him? The Linli building? Yen Hongxiu heard the keyword and looked at Su Li eagerly. She said, "Are you the boss of the Linli building, Mr. Li?" Su Li nodded slightly and suddenly stretched out her hand to grasp the void behind her. Swish! In Yen Hongxiu's almost dull eyes, an arrow automatically flew out of the quiver and fell into her hand. She said, "Miss Hongxiu, time is running out. Tonight, I'll show you how to use this bow." Su Li took a slight breath and slowly pulled the silver longbow with the arrow in her hand. Buzz! The bow made a clear buzzing sound as if it was cheering. A bit of fluorescence gradually lit up from the tip of the arrow. It was as bright as a star and quickly enlarged in front of Yen Zai and his sister. At this moment, it was even brighter than the moonlight in the sky. Clang! The arrow was shot out like a meteor. There was no sound after it got out of the bow. When the light disappeared, Yen Hongxiu woke up. She couldn't help but run to the target. She saw a fist-sized hole in the center of the target. The arrow went deep into the ground, leaving a hole that couldn't be found anymore. What kind of archery is this? Yen Hongxiu stood in the cold wind in a daze. She couldn't help but pinch her arm. It hurts. She hissed softly and looked up at Su Li, who stood beside Yen Zai and held the bow with one hand. Her clear eyes immediately lit up. The scorching heat instantly burned all the previous disdain and doubt, leaving only deep worship. Is she an immortal? My brother found an immortal master for me? Yen Hongxiu's eyes were hot and she immediately ran to Su Li. Su Li stood in the same place and felt strange. At the moment when she pulled the bow and shot the arrow, another group of unknown stars seemed to automatically escape and disappeared into the arrow. The force used was the same force. But the power of this arrow was much more powerful than that of the archery she practiced in the past 2 days. Yen Zai was shocked and his blood was boiling. This was the inborn realm. He was like an immortal on the earth. Even his father didn't dare to be disrespectful in front of Mr. Li. He only relied on his own strength to control his destiny. This was the life he wanted. Immortal Master, you are so awesome. At this time, Yen Hongxiu walked back from the target. She simply knelt down and obediently admitted her mistake. She said, "Immortal Master, forgive me for my disrespect just now. I will follow you to practice archery in the future and won't tarnish your reputation." Even if Yen Hongxiu didn't know much about the martial arts circle, her eyes wouldn't lie. The person who could shoot the light must be a senior who was more powerful than her father. She finally understood why the third brother was scared in front of Mr. Li. She finally knew the third brother's good intention. It was ridiculous that she contradicted such a person before. She could only hope that it was not too late to kneel down and admit her mistake. I have no intention to accept you as an apprentice. Chapter 98. It seemed that Su Li didn't see Yen Hongxiu's expression and continued to say, "The fate between you and me began with a deal between child Yen and me. We're not master and disciple." His words were cold and indifferent, which made Yen Hongxiu's heart cold. She looked a little better. It turned out that Mr. Li was not angry because of her behavior. But why did she feel more bitter in her heart? Maybe my performance just now was better. Will this person really accept me as a disciple? Yen Hongxiu still held an unrealistic dream. She played with Yen Zai since childhood and was greatly influenced by him. In addition to the dream of being a female general, she also dreamed of being a chivalrous heroine in the martial arts circle. In her mind, Mr. Li was obviously her ideal image. Mr. Li. Yen Zai took a deep breath and barely regained his composure. If my sister learns archery from you, can she really break through that realm within a year? Of course not. Su Li looked at Yen Zai and teased him. If the inborn realm is really as easy as you said, wouldn't the martial arts circle be in a mess? Mr. Li, you mean? Yen Zai was immediately anxious. Su Li waved her hand and said lightly, "I naturally have other ways to let your sister master this bow, although it is not as powerful as the inborn realm. But if she can use this bow to fight, at least your sister's archery skills will be better than County Chief Yan's. Young master, can you accept this result?" Before Yen Zai said it, Yen Hongxiu shouted in surprise, "I can accept it." Dad was the #1 expert in Qinghe town, although it was only on the surface. However, if she could surpass her father in archery, she would not need to be manipulated by her family. It would not be impossible for her to become a female general in the future. Our brother and sister can naturally accept Sir's words. Yen Zai's face was filled with joy. Then he hesitated a little and said, Don't worry, young master. The Linli building will not let you down. Su Li made a promise and looked at Yen Hongxiu again. This year, Miss Hongxiu will suffer a little. Yen Hongxiu was slightly flustered, but she finally gritted her teeth and said, Mr. Li, don't worry. As long as I can achieve my goal, I can persist. Then the first step. Su Li put the silver bow in Yen Hongxiu's hand and said, No matter when you eat, sleep, or go anywhere in the future, you must be careful. They had to carry this bow with them and stroke it at least 1,000 times a day. If you can do it, I'll tell you the next step in a month. Can't leave my body? Yen Hongxiu stared blankly at the silver longbow in her hand, which was not much shorter than her height. Her face instantly darkened. Jin Family East Courtyard Study. Jin Cheng-eo lazily leaned against the back of the chair. He lowered his eyes and said in a very oppressive voice, What did my father say? The manservant who was bowing in front of Jin Cheng-eo was shocked and immediately replied, Master said that you should stop for the time being. You can't deal with the Linli building before we find out the culprit. When Jin Cheng-eo heard the words, he immediately laughed in a low voice. I'm old after all. I'm overcautious. My goal was not only the Dahan country. How could I waste time in the small Qinghe province? Since he doesn't allow me to touch the Linli building, what about the embroidery workshop? The manservant bent his body and didn't dare to move. He knew that the master didn't ask him at all. If you can get the embroidery workshop, the Jin family will have a greater say. The head of the Jin family looked at his son with a complicated and ambitious look. He said, But Gong Xiangjuan is extremely difficult to deal with. If you want the embroidery workshop, you can't avoid her. She and the housekeeper of the Yen family may not be able to enter the door if you visit them. Father, you must be joking. Jin Cheng-eo patted the folding fan in his hand and laughed wantonly. The workshop owner of the embroidery workshop is a little girl. The supervisor is not only effective to the satrap's mansion, but also to the embroidery workshop. The head of the Jin family's pupils shrank and his face immediately darkened. He said, What do you want to do? We can't offend the Gong family. Father, don't worry. I know what to do. Jin Cheng-eo's eyes were full of smiles. An inexplicable sense of danger slowly diffused from him. Even his father, the head of the Jin family, couldn't help but feel cold. Since his son came back that year, he seemed to be a different person. Although he was very pleased with his son's outstanding talent and ability, he could no longer feel the affection between father and son. On this day, Su Li was bored inside. Suddenly, someone came to pass a message. Something happened to the embroidery workshop? Su Li raised her eyebrows and glanced at Gao Dehai, who came to report with sweat all over his head. She said in a low voice, Take me there. Looking at Su Li's calm face, Gao Dehai also calmed down a lot. He hurriedly took Su Li to drive the carriage to the embroidery workshop. At this time, to attack the embroidery workshop, sitting in the carriage, Su Li pondered from time to time. There were not many families who dared to attack the embroidery workshop. Not to mention that Gong Xiangjuan was still alive. She could guess who dared to attack the embroidery workshop at this time without thinking. Has Jin Cheng-eo already got the practice method at this time? Su Li gently rubbed her eyebrows and suddenly smiled meaningfully. She said, It turns out that it is much simpler than I thought. Whoa, Gao Dehai stopped the carriage. Su Li immediately walked out and rushed to the back hall of the embroidery workshop. At this moment, the atmosphere in the back hall of the embroidery workshop was extremely solemn. Jian, the chief steward, stood in the front. Behind him stood a group of angry embroidery artificers. Opposite them was a group of cold-looking rich businessmen. Everyone, I have already said that this batch of embroidery is not from the embroidery workshop. The embroidery workshop in the Qinghe province is full of treasures. The embroidery you take out is full of mistakes. Even the basic stitches are wrong. How can it be produced by our embroidery workshop? Jian explained with a calm face. The leading rich businessman on the opposite side sneered, "Old man, you really know how to flatter yourself. Since your embroidery workshop changed its owner, I found that these rubbish often mixed in the embroidery. It must be that your embroidery workshop embezzled the profits. You still don't admit it." Jia An's expression changed immediately. How could he not know what kind of person the new workshop owner was? Every time she came here, she never mentioned the business profits of the embroidery workshop. She even didn't take the salary in recent months. Would such a workshop owner think of ways to embezzle the profits of the embroidery workshop? Jian didn't need to think to know that someone wanted to attack Su Li. Thinking of the young girl with superb craftsmanship, Jian became more determined. He would never allow the workshop owner Su to be slandered. "What's so noisy?" At this time, a clear voice came from outside the door. Su Li rushed in with a bit of concern on her face. Gao Dehai, who was behind her, saw that there was no change in the scene. He immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Workshop owner, you finally come." A group of embroidery artificers with red eyes saw Su Li. It seemed that they found their backbone and surrounded her. Since Su Li took over the embroidery workshop, their lives were the same as before. But their embroidery skills had more or less improved under Su Li's guidance. Therefore, although Su Li was the youngest among them, it did not prevent them from being respectful to Su Li. Seeing this scene, the rich businessman curled his lips. He didn't expect that this silly girl had such a high prestige in the embroidery workshop. "What a pity, workshop owner, you come at the right time." Jian looked worried. He didn't think that Su Li's coming would be of any use. But he still explained the matter. Su Li nodded slightly. She walked to the pile of ragged cloth and squatted down to check it carefully. The rich businessman immediately smiled and said, "Workshop owner Su, even if you see it 10,000 times, you can't change the fact that these are from the embroidery workshop. You'd better admit it. Did you embezzle our hard-earned money?" "Yes, admit it quickly. Bitch. I didn't expect that you are so young and greedy. I'm afraid that you are dizzy with glory. Do you think that the whole embroidery workshop belongs to you? Bastard, get out of the embroidery workshop quickly." The embroidery artificers behind the rich businessman immediately scolded Su Li. Jia En's face changed. Seeing that Su Li was still squatting down to check the ragged cloth, the embroidery artificers couldn't help but cry in a low voice. God, the workshop owner was only a 16-year-old girl. Why did she suffer so much abuse? Jean Rulin hid among the embroidery artificers. She was so happy that she almost laughed out loud. Su Li, I didn't expect that you would be a thorn in my brother's side. Now I want to see how you can keep your identity. It's a big crime to embezzle the profit of the embroidery workshop." After seeing the last batch of embroidery, Su Li slowly stood up and raised her head. Her expression didn't change at all. She said lightly, "Have you finished?" The whole back hall was suddenly quiet. Even the rich businessman's face changed. He was held by an invisible force and his breath was slightly short. Su Li smiled slightly and said, "Since you have finished, it's my turn." Then she picked up a piece of embroidery and asked, "Squire, do you remember the specific delivery time of this embroidery?" The rich businessman's expression didn't change. He snorted and said, "Who remembers that kind of trivial stuff? These substandard products are mixed with good ones. It's very difficult for me to pick them out one by one." "What about the approximate time?" Su Li's smile seemed to be meaningful. "Is it within 1 month? That is to say, these are the orders delivered after I took office?" Su Li's words obviously meant something. Many embroidery artificers thought of something and their eyes lit up. The rich businessman didn't notice this and immediately nodded and said, "Of course. When Ms. Gong was the workshop owner, such a thing never happened. How can I doubt the character of the old workshop owner?" Clap, clap. Su Li immediately clapped her hands with a smile, which made the rich businessman and others dumbfounded. "Then today's matter is a bit interesting. Qin Shang, explain to this squire." Su Li said a person's name. Suddenly, a young woman with a shrewd face walked out from the embroidery artificers behind her. This woman was a talent that Su Li found in nearly 1 month's observation. Qing Shang looked at Su Li with a little excitement and then hurriedly bent down to check the cloth. Seeing this, the rich businessmen were shocked. Could it be that there really was a flaw? One of them subconsciously looked at Jean Rulin. Jean Rulin immediately shook her head slightly, indicating that she didn't know. Su Li saw this scene but didn't point it out. Workshop owner, I have checked it. Chapter 99. Hearing Qing Shang's words, the expressions of all the wealthy merchants changed drastically. Seeing this, Qing Shang sneered and continued, the first possibility is that this batch of embroidery came from the list of goods from a month ago. However, the squire had already denied it, so there was only the second possibility. That is, this batch of embroidery came from the apprentices of the embroidery workshop. Our embroidery workshop has never allowed apprentices to make a single. This rule is set by the government. Even the workshop owner can't change it. Jian came forward with a smile on his face, but his eyes were so cold that it could almost kill people. He said, I would like to ask you all, where did you steal this batch of inferior goods? The embroidery of the apprentices of the embroidery workshop in Qinghe Prefecture is destroyed every day. Looks like this old man needs to do a thorough investigation. You don't spout nonsense. The leading merchant stuttered for a long time and couldn't say a complete sentence. In the end, he could only say bitterly, you guys are good. Let's wait and see. Seeing this group of people leaving in a hurry like dogs that had lost their homes, the whole embroidery workshop burst into cheers. We won. Boss, you're amazing. You solved the problem as soon as you arrived. It's great that I can prove my innocence. There must be a spy in the embroidery workshop. Don't let me know who it is, or I'll skin him alive. Jian smiled and sent everyone back to work. He walked to Su Li and said with shame, Workshop owner, I'm a disgrace to you. It doesn't matter. After all, you are not familiar with embroidery. Su Li waved her hand and said, it's not a good thing for apprentice embroidery to be leaked out. This matter should be carefully investigated and no one can be spared. Jian bowed slightly and was finally completely convinced by Su Li. It turned out that the owner of the old workshop did not choose people to sit in this position at random. He had thought that Su Li would be in a panic when she encountered such a thing, and he would be the one to save her. He didn't expect the truth to be completely different from what he had imagined. He was even comforted by this young lady. Thinking of this, Jian smiled bitterly. After Su Li left the embroidery workshop, she didn't have time to go back to the school. Instead, she came to the Linli building immediately. Investigate Gong Xiangjuan's condition immediately. Chu Qingning, prepare the medicinal materials on the list. I will refine the medicine overnight. Fang Yuan, go to the Jin family to see whether there are officers and soldiers of the supervisor. Don't be found. There are seniors in the Jin family. After a series of orders, all the senior members of the Linli building were gone. Su Li stood on the top floor and looked at the south of the city. The light in her eyes flickered. No one knew what she was thinking. Su Li, I bought all the things. Even if I couldn't buy them, I still stole them. See if I'm right? Chu Qingning hurriedly came in and put a large bag of things in front of Su Li. Su Li glanced at it and took it into the underground addendum. Li Chu Li Li. Su, Chu Li and Chu. Li came. Su, Li said. Li, Su, comma, of people. Yen Hongxiu murmured, but she still carried the bow on her back. Then she picked up the ordinary long bow and practiced. Yen Shishuan looked at her in the dark, and he was more confused. His daughter's enthusiasm for practicing the bow suddenly increased these days. Besides, she carried the bow all day and behaved strangely. He was worried about her. He had been following her secretly, but he didn't see anything special. As for what Yen Hongxiu was thinking, he certainly couldn't know. Forget it. In the last year, let her do whatever she wants. She is influenced by Zai too much. Yen Shishuan's eyes dimmed when he thought of Yen Zai. He said, Zai, the martial arts circle is not as simple as you think. When you grow up, you will understand my good intentions. That circle is not suitable for ordinary people. Late at night, the stars were getting dimmer. Squeak! The wooden door of the underground adytum was opened, and there was a faint smell of medicine. Su Li walked out of the door with a tired face. She spent a lot of energy practicing today. Are you all right? It was the first time for Fang Yuan to see Su Li with such an expression. He subconsciously asked. Su Li glanced at him, and then put a bottle of white powder in his palm. She said, You should have inquired about the residence of Butler Jean. After dawn, if it is me. Fang Yuan's expression changed slightly. He held the bottle tightly and asked, Is there any other way? Su Li smiled and said, What? Can you think of a better way? Fang Yuan was silent immediately. After a while, he put away the bottle and said in a deep voice, If what you said is not good, I will do it myself. Su Li didn't answer again. She turned around and put a letter in Chu Qingning's hand. She said, You go to Yan Zai and give it to him alone. I believe he will know what to do after reading it. By the way, how about the news I asked Haydn to inquire about? Chu Qingning felt strange and said, Su Li, how did you guess that Gong Xiangjuan would be seriously ill? Was it you who poisoned her? Su Li shook her head with a smile and said, You are not as smart as Yin Xuetong. If not, how could that silly girl fall in love with you? Chu Qingning stared at her and said with hatred, If you don't want to tell me, I will ask Xuetong. Fang Yuan felt helpless and thought, You still have the mood to joke at this time. After dawn, Su Li returned to the courtyard of the school. Mammy Li just woke up and saw Su Li sitting in the central room. She immediately asked, Miss, don't you sleep for a while? Su Li bowed her head and tidied up her clothes. She said calmly, I don't want to be too embarrassed. What? Mammy Li looked confused. Suddenly, boom. The wooden door of the courtyard was suddenly blasted open by a huge force. It broke into two halves and fell to the ground. A group of officers and soldiers with knives rushed in aggressively. When they saw Su Li, they immediately surrounded her. Workshop owner Su, now the supervisory department suspects that you collude with embroidery merchants and embezzle profits from them. The supervisor ordered that from today on, you will be put into the prison of the supervisory department to await the trial. Mammy Li was shocked. When she was about to argue with Su Li, the officers and soldiers directly put a knife on her neck and she couldn't move. Su Li didn't seem to see the knives all around her. She said lightly, What happened yesterday is slander. I am the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop. My status is equal to the supervisor and satrap. The supervisory department arrested me without evidence. Aren't you afraid that the satrap's mansion will file a lawsuit to Yunjing? The leader's face changed slightly. He immediately sneered and said, Workshop owner Su, you are exaggerating. The supervisory department just asks you to go back to cooperate with the investigation. If you are wronged, you can explain to the supervisor. Take her away. Then, two people wanted to press Su Li's hands. Su Li shook them off fiercely. She was angry and said, How dare you? I can go by myself. I want to see how the supervisor will slander an innocent person. The leader sneered in his heart. He had never seen anyone who could come out safely after entering the prison of the supervisory department. But on the surface, he still stretched out his hand and said, Workshop owner Su, please. A group of officers and soldiers of the supervisory department didn't make a detour. They just took Su Li away from the gate of the school. Just for a moment, the whole Qinghe town was in an uproar. What? Su Li was taken away by the supervisory department? When Romin pounded the table angrily and asked anxiously, When did it happen? Damn it. Sister Gong just fell ill. The Jean family immediately took action. They are really well informed. No, I have to go to the satrap's mansion. I can't let anything happen to Su Li. The spies of the Linli building got the news immediately. Fang Yuan and Chu Qingning couldn't help but tremble slightly. At the same time, they acted according to Su Li's order. Su Li was taken away? By the Jean family? Yan Hongxiu was still eating breakfast. When she heard such a shocking news, she almost choked to death. "Miss, I just know it. Will Suli be all right?" Juan said worriedly. Although the little lecturer looked extremely strict, the temperament and embroidery skills of the miss had obviously improved. How could such a good lecturer do bad things? "I'm going to find my father." Putting down the half-eaten breakfast, Yen Hongxiu carried the bow and ran out. Although she said she hated Suli, she immediately panicked when she heard that Suli was taken away by such a vicious family. "Suli, you have to hold on." When Yen Hongxiu came to her father's yard, she didn't find Yen Shixuan. When she asked the housekeeper, she knew that her father had already taken people to denounce Yen Shixuan. On the other side, Yen Zai didn't feel anything when he heard the news. Although the embroidery workshop was in trouble for the Yen family, he couldn't help with his identity and ability. He could only not get involved and make trouble for his father. Whoosh! Suddenly, a dart penetrated into the study and nailed directly in front of Yen Zai. It was only an inch away from Yen Zai's hand. "Who is it?" Yen Zai was shocked. He immediately turned over and jumped out of the window. He looked around but didn't see anyone. He went back to the study and took down the dart. When he opened the note on the dart, his face immediately changed. "Ms. Li." After reading the small words on it, Yen Zai's breath immediately changed from helplessness to confidence. He immediately burned the note. He didn't expect that Ms. Li would also intervene in this matter. As long as he acted according to the plan, he would definitely be able to cause a blow to the Jin family and prevent the Jin family from continuing to seize the embroidery workshop. "Father, let me help you this time." Thinking of this, Yen Zai went out confidently. At this moment, in the supervisory department, Yen Shixuan looked at Jin Jintian, the master of the Jin family, who was dressed in the official uniform of the supervisor. "Jin Jintian, you have gone too far this time. You arrested the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop without any evidence. Do you really think that the Qinghe province belongs to your family?" The matter of the Tiger Village and Wu Lin had already made his patience reach the limit. The matter of the workshop owner of the embroidery workshop even touched his nerves. If Jin Jintian couldn't give an explanation, he would definitely take action directly without any scruples. Even if both sides were injured, he would not hesitate. Jin Jintian laughed and said, "Satrap Yen, don't worry. I just act according to the rules. Yesterday, a group of rich businessmen came to me to complain that he was embezzled a lot of silver by the embroidery workshop. He went to the embroidery workshop to reason but was driven out. Then he took out the inferior embroidery of the embroidery workshop. Since the authentication and material evidence are both here, I naturally have to invite workshop owner Su back and investigate it carefully." Yen Shixuan frowned and said, "Jin Jintian, you should know the regulations of the supervisory department better than me. You can't make a confession under torture. You arrested her without investigation. Don't you care about the regulations of the Dahan country? Lord Yen, you are wrong. Workshop owner Su is also a person of high status and power. If I arrest her after the investigation, it will be easy for the information to be leaked and workshop owner Su can escape." Jin Jintian was full of smiles, like a smiling tiger. The rules are dead, but people are alive. Therefore, this lowly official could only come up with this plan and capture him first. However, Lord Yen can rest assured that the supervisory department will take good care of workshop owner Su during the investigation. I promise that she will not lose a hair. As long as Lord Yen can prove that workshop owner Su is innocent, I will let her go immediately. Yen Shixuan's face was faintly blue. After looking at Jin Jintian for a few seconds, he finally couldn't help but snort coldly and leave. Jin Jintian was very well prepared. It was meaningless for him to waste time here. Now he could only hope that the group of so-called rich businessmen had not gone far. Walking out of the door, Yen Shixuan looked at the clear sky outside the supervisory department and sighed deeply. You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.